Hey, welcome in. Tonight's story is not easy, but it's necessary. We're going back to a time when hunger wasn't just a feeling in your stomach. It was a force that bent entire villages, snapped moral codes, and left behind scars buried beneath stone floors and whispered lullabies. This is medieval Europe at its most fragile. When winter lasted too long, the harvest failed, and people turned inward in the most terrifying ways. It's a story of desperation, yes, but also of survival, of quiet resilience, and the things people did not because they were monsters, but because they were still human and starving. If you find yourself pulled into these strange corners of history, go ahead and like and subscribe, but only if this kind of storytelling feels like a place you want to return to. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. I always picture these stories flickering like lanterns across time zones. All right, take a deep breath, let the night settle in around you, and let's begin. This is the story of why cannibalism haunted starving medieval villages. It doesn't begin with a scream, it begins with a whisper, faint, dry, and low in the belly. At first, it's easy to ignore. A grumble when the bread runs out early. A tightness behind the ribs when supper is just broth and barley. You convince yourself it's nothing. Tomorrow will bring better rations, a stranger's cart, a rabbit in the snare. But tomorrow doesn't change. Tomorrow is hungrier. The grumble becomes a groan. The tightness becomes a twisting ache. And then quietly, something shifts. Not in the fields or the cellars, but inside the mind. There's a new thought now, lurking in the back of the skull like rot in the corner of a timbered wall. A question that dares not name itself. What would I do if it got worse? And that question festers, because it will get worse. The snow keeps falling. The crops stay buried. The larder is bare, the barrel dry. The goats cry at night, then fall silent. And so the village begins to change. It doesn't collapse. It mutates. Laughter fades. Eyes dart more quickly. Doors close sooner. Words become fewer, and the spaces between meals stretch wider until the only thing moving in the square is the wind and whatever ghosts it carries. There are always those who say the famine came from the sky, punishment from above for sins too widespread to count. Others say it was greed, hoarding, a tax too heavy to pay in seed and grain. But the why of it barely matters once it begins. Hunger isn't interested in cause. It's interested in consequence. It strips people down to their oldest instincts. It doesn't arrive with horror. It creates it. Not all at once, and not with spectacle, but slowly, as if trying to see who will break and who will bear it. And bear it they do, at first. They chew leather, grind acorns, boil weeds. A stew made of stone and bark, thickened with hope and desperation. But you can't eat memory. You can't make soup from prayers. And soon the village remembers the stories it swore were just tales. Murmured warnings passed down like old recipes. Stories about winters when people didn't just die, they disappeared. Stories that no one tells with a straight face, but that no one quite forgets. Stories that make people knock twice before entering a neighbor's home, even when there's no food left to steal. It's around the hearth that the first changes become visible. The hearth, once the center of warmth and welcome, becomes something else. A symbol of scarcity. A mouth of flame that swallows the last of the firewood and still leaves the room cold. Children sit closer, not for comfort, but because the blankets are gone and there's nothing else to do. Parents avoid looking at each other when the pot is empty. They feed the children first, or they pretend to. And in the silence that follows each meal, you can almost hear it. The hunger beneath the hearth, clawing through the walls, waiting for the next rule to fall. Because rules are luxuries, morality is meat on the bones. When the stomach screams long enough, it drowns out the conscience. And what comes next is not evil. It is need. It is math. It is the unthinkable, stepping forward with perfect logic. Not everyone in the village will die, but someone will be eaten. It starts with a flurry. Not a blizzard, not yet. Just a gentle white dusting that settles over the village roofs and fields, pretty as a painting. But it keeps coming. One day turns into 3, and then a week. The roads vanish under drifts. The sky becomes a blank, heavy slate. Men shrug into cloaks and say it's early this year. The elders nod grimly. The young laugh and throw snowballs. But soon the laughter stops. The snow thickens. The winds sharpen. And the silence begins. It creeps in with the cold, fills the spaces between words, between footsteps, between the crackle of wood in the hearth. The animals are the first to show the change. Chickens stop laying. Sheep huddle, motionless. A cow collapses in the barn one morning, her breath frozen on her whiskers. There's no ceremony, just a knife and a grim understanding. Better in the pot than wasted, but it won't be enough. It never is. Because the winter that's arrived isn't just early, it's ravenous. The harvest was poor before the snow fell. Too much rain, too little sun. The grain came up thin. The root vegetables rotted in the soil. The stores were already meager when the first frost kissed the ground. Now, weeks in, they're barely more than memory. The cellars are dry, the barrels echo. Rats have eaten what little was left behind. The chickens are gone, eaten or frozen stiff. Even the dogs eye their owners with uneasy expressions, drawn by the scent of something cooking, though it's only boiled cloth and bones scraped clean last season. And outside, it does not stop. The snow piles higher than the windowsills. The well is frozen over. No one comes down from the hills or through the forest. The roads are gone. The world has shrunk to the village and the cold, and neither one has anything left to offer. Inside the homes, people begin to shrink too. In appetite, in spirit, in body. Children cry less, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. Their bellies ache, but there's no energy to sob. Women stop baking, not just because there's no flour, but because they've stopped pretending it will return. Men mutter over the fire and sleep more than they speak. The days blur into each other, white skies, black nights, the same emptiness echoing between them. Time becomes a thing measured not in hours, but in how many times someone says, "We'll make it to spring." But spring feels further away than God. Because this isn't a season, it's a sentence. And it doesn't care about prayers. It's not a catastrophe that makes people desperate. It's the slow, grinding erosion of everything familiar. A loaf smaller than the last. A neighbor who doesn't come to the gathering anymore. A mother who looks at her baby too long, her eyes too empty. The village doesn't break apart in fire and blood. It splinters in silence. And when the snow refuses to melt, when the barns echo hollow and the wells don't thaw, something else begins to stir beneath the skin of the villagers. Not madness, yet, but something older. A hunger deeper than fear. The kind of hunger that starts to look around the room and count the people left. At first, they try to keep the rituals. Mealtime still comes at regular intervals, though there's little to eat. A thin broth ladled into cracked bowls. A crust of bread passed around and torn into finger-sized scraps. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows the illusion must be maintained, especially for the children. It's not just food they're running out of. It's structure, sanity. So they sit, hands folded, heads bowed as if in prayer, and chew slowly, pretending it's still a meal. The bread is more stone than sustenance, black from charring, gritty from the flour stretched with ash or dirt or whatever was swept from the corners of the mill. It cracks teeth. It tastes of desperation. And still, it's eaten like a gift. Soon even that runs dry. The flour's gone, and the millstone sits useless, like a relic from a time when wheat was real and not just memory. They scrape bark from the trees, boil it until the tannins make the stew taste of bitterness and wood. Some add weeds, others drop in bones already picked clean long ago. The soup thickens, but only with disappointment. No one complains, not loudly. Complaints waste breath, and pride is fading. It's a quiet erosion like frost melting into soil. The once proud father who used to boast of his livestock now counts moldy turnips and watches the sky with hollow eyes. The mother who kept her linens clean now wraps her children in anything dry, even if it stinks of mildew or animal fat. Dignity becomes an extravagance. At first, the poor are the ones to bend. They beg, they barter, they cry in public. But it doesn't stop there. The wealthy run out of their hoarded stores. The clerics run out of sermons. The healer runs out of herbs and starts prescribing boiled leather and hot water compresses. Everyone begins to look the same, pale, thin, sunken. Hunger is the great equalizer, but not in the noble sense. It doesn't make people kinder. It makes them smaller. Grudges vanish not from forgiveness, but from lack of energy to maintain them. Courtesy becomes a ghost, haunting the silence that falls when a neighbor turns away instead of sharing the last of their crumbs. The worst is not the hunger itself. It's the shame. The moments when someone is caught scraping the bottom of a pot with their finger or caught sneaking into a field for roots that don't belong to them. The silence after a child is found chewing on a bootstrap or gnawing on firewood for splinters of sap. These are the moments when eyes look away, when nobody speaks because speaking would make it real. Pride dies quietly. No funeral, no lament. Just a lowering of the eyes, a softening of the voice, a stomach that growls in a room too silent. And still, they hold on. Not because there's hope left weeks ago, but because stopping feels like admitting they've already become something less than human. And that, more than hunger, is the hardest thing to swallow. There comes a night when the wind howls just a little louder, and the pot on the hearth bubbles with a smell that doesn't resemble food, but it's hot, and that's all that matters. Inside, a belt curls in boiling water, its stiff leather softening like meat. A mother stirs it slowly, not because she thinks it will help, but because stirring gives her hands something to do besides tremble. She tells the children it's special stew, that it'll keep them warm. The little ones still believe her. The older ones don't, but they drink it anyway, sipping from wooden cups and pretending not to notice the floating threads, the oily taste of desperation that clings to their lips. They say thank you with cracked voices. They smile with dry mouths, and they pretend it's enough. Outside, a father digs. The ground is frozen, the spade useless, so he kneels and claws at the soil with numb fingers, hunting for roots that aren't there. Last year's parsnips, maybe, or the ghost of a potato. He doesn't expect to find anything, but the digging matters, the movement, the idea that something might be left, that there's still a layer of the world not yet stripped bare. His nails break, his knuckles bleed, and when he finally pulls up a fistful of stringy, half-rotten root, he holds it in both hands like treasure. It's not edible, not really, but it's something. And something feels like a victory now. In the homes, meals are no longer planned. They're improvised from memory and scraps. Dust from the flour sack, Crumbs swept from beneath the table, water thickened with boiled parchment, grease scraped from the hinges of a storage chest. Every night is a gamble, every bite a reminder. Hunger no longer whispers, it shouts. It twists the stomach and fogs the mind. It makes people do things they never thought they'd consider. The pious man who once led the church choir now scrapes grease from candle holders with his teeth. The proud widow trades her heirloom necklace for a rat caught in the alley. Shame becomes another kind of hunger, ever present, gnawing, but not enough to stop them. Because pride doesn't fill a child's belly. They try not to speak of it. The things they've eaten, the things they've considered. They avoid eye contact during meals, avoid naming what's in the bowl. Silence becomes a blanket, thin but necessary. Regret simmers with the broth. And still, they eat, because survival no longer feels noble. It feels like a slow unraveling of the self, a quiet surrender that comes in pieces. With each belt boiled, each boot scraped, each night spent listening to the wind instead of sleeping, the line between what they would and would not do blurs. What remains is not a question of morality, but of timing, how long they can endure before the last thread of restraint snaps. And when it does, they won't talk about it. They'll chew and swallow and pray they forget the taste. Around the hearth, stories are told, not to entertain, but to control the silence. The kind of silence that creeps in when bellies are empty and hope feels like a forgotten word. A grandmother leans in close, her voice raspy, her breath sharp with hunger, and begins again the tale of the crone in the woods, the one with black teeth and a nose like a bent stick, who lures children with sweet smells and bakes them in her oven. The little ones shiver, not just from cold, but from the way the shadows move when the fire flickers. They don't know the story's true purpose. They think it's about monsters, but the older ones know. These tales are not fiction. They are camouflage. Warning signs disguised as folklore, passed down like recipes to teach a lesson no one dares speak aloud. These stories grow louder in the lean years. When the fields turn to dust and the snow arrives too early, the forest becomes more than a place of mystery. It becomes a mirror. In the tales, witches eat children. In reality, hunger eats everything. And when a village watches its stores vanish and its animals fall still in the frost, the line between myth and memory begins to blur. Suddenly, the old story of the traveler who stayed one night too many in a stranger's cottage becomes something else. A question, a rumor, a hint. Did he ever leave? Did she feed him or feed on him? And though the villagers laugh nervously when the story is told, no one asks too many questions about who invented it or why it's told only during the harshest winters. It's not just witches. There are spirits in the woods, they say, that take on the shape of loved ones, luring you deeper into the frost until you're too far to scream. Demons who wear your brother's face, who knock on the door with your mother's voice, and only want one thing: what's beneath your skin. These legends speak of hunger, yes, but not of theirs, of yours. The hunger that changes you, hollowing out your heart until you forget what meat once tasted like and remember only how to find it. The stories are warnings, not of what hunts you, but of what you could become. Even the church bells echo with old sermons of temptation. The body, they say, is sacred, but when left to rot in the cold, who is to say what the starving mind might excuse? The priest tells stories of sinners who fed on flesh in the time of the great famines. He doesn't name them, but the names are known. Grandfathers whisper them over grave soil, just loud enough to scare the living, just quiet enough to hide the truth. Because deep down, they understand. Folklore is not born from fantasy. It is born from memory, smoothed over with time, painted with demons and monsters, so that the people who acted like monsters don't have to be remembered. It's easier to believe the story of a witch in the woods than the truth of a neighbor who crossed a line. Easier to say it was a demon than it was us. The ground in the parish yard has turned to stone. The frost runs so deep that even the gravedigger's pickaxe can't break it. The bodies beneath lie in silence, wrapped in linen or wood, untouched by time, but not by thought. The living walk past the churchyard with their eyes low, their hands clenched around empty baskets, pretending not to smell the faint sweetness of decay rising from beneath the snow. Hunger sharpens the senses. It quiets morality. And when the cupboards are bare and the children have stopped crying, that churchyard becomes less a place of reverence and more a question. A terrible, gnawing question. It doesn't start with the bold. It starts with whispers. Someone saw footprints by the fence. Someone swore they heard the latch on the chapel shed open in the dark. But no one says the word, not yet. They speak of dogs, of scavengers, of some shadow moving wrong beneath the moon. But everyone knows what's really being said. There are no dogs left in the village. They were eaten weeks ago. One night, a boy is caught creeping through the parish gate, his arms full of linens, his face pale with fear or guilt. No one asks what he was doing. No one wants to hear the answer. The priest, grim and brittle as an old nail, drags him before the altar. He calls it sacrilege, a sin against the dead. But even he cannot say, with certainty, that he wouldn't have done the same, because he, too, has lost weight. His robe hangs looser. His sermons are shorter. His voice no longer booms. It rasps. Soon after, a grave is found open, not fresh, just disturbed. The wood of the coffin cracked, the wrappings torn, the body gone. No animals could have done it. No beast would have taken the whole corpse, left no trail, no paw prints. Only hands do that. Human hands. And then the silence becomes unbearable. The villagers begin to confess, not with words, but with eyes. Looking down, looking away, looking guilty. Because in the middle of the night, someone gave in. Someone remembered that the body, once buried, was still meat, still soft, still edible. And after one, there are two, then four, then more. The parish becomes a harvest ground, picked over with quiet desperation. Those who feed do not boast. They do not speak of what they've done. They wipe their mouths and return to prayer, asking forgiveness not with repentance, but with silence. The priest tries to lock the gate. They break it open. He tries to guard the yard. They wait until he sleeps. And as the cold deepens, and the last food vanishes like a dream at morning, even the holiest soil cannot keep its secrets. The graveyard becomes not just a place for mourning, but a butcher's shelf for those left behind. The dead do not protest, but the living, those who watch and do nothing, those who feed and try to forget, they carry the guilt in their bones long after spring returns. Because some winters never really end, not in the mind, not in the soul. At first, it's just a feeling, a strange stillness in the morning sky. The wind carries no wing beats. The treetops remain undisturbed. No cause. No shadows drifting overhead. The crows, once ever present, perched on rooftops, strutting through the snow, picking at carcasses, are simply gone. For weeks, they had been a reliable, if grim, presence. Scavengers thriving where everything else suffered. But now, Even they have fled, not frightened, consumed. Their bones buried under ash or scraped clean with shaking hands. One more line crossed in a long winter of transgressions. Then the dogs begin to vanish, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, like water draining from a cracked barrel. A growl one night, silence the next. A trail of paw prints ending in a patch of churned snow. Owners say they ran off, got lost, maybe followed a scent too far. But no one truly believes that. Not after what happened in the churchyard. Not after what was found near the river, half frozen and stripped to the ribs. The dogs didn't leave. They were taken because hunger does not honor loyalty. And once the animals are gone, the village begins to turn in on itself. Eyes linger too long. Neighbors pass without greeting. A mother holds her child a little tighter when a stranger walks too close. Every cough, every stumble, every limp is observed. The old man who can't rise from bed. The widow who hasn't been seen in days. The apprentice who grew pale and faint after giving away the last of his bread. They are noticed not with pity, but with calculation. The weak are no longer protected. They are evaluated. This is when the fear becomes personal, not of wolves or spirits, but of one another. Every creak of a floorboard in the night becomes a threat. Every knock on the door is met with suspicion. Doors are locked. Fires are kept low. Families sleep huddled, not for warmth, but for safety. Trust fractures under the weight of starvation. And yet, even as they grow wary of each other, none dare speak the truth aloud. That someone in the village, maybe many, have begun to consider the unthinkable. That the meat that once came with 4 legs or wings or fur is gone. And all that's left are the ones who still breathe. No one admits it, but you can see it in their eyes. The way they follow you when you pass. The way conversations die when you enter a room. The way children are pulled away as if your presence alone is dangerous. Hunger has rewritten their instincts. Compassion has become caution. And kindness, a memory too costly to keep. The crows were the first to know. They always are. They can sense when a place no longer belongs to the living. When even scavengers aren't safe. When the balance between survival and savagery has tipped too far to return. They left before the village could collapse entirely, before meat became a secret and neighbors became prey. And now, without their grim chorus in the sky, the silence is unbearable. Not because it's empty, but because it listens. It starts with excuses. A toddler wandered too far from the door. A child slipped into the forest, chasing a bird or a snowflake. A boy took his father's tools and never came back. The stories come quick, ready-made, as if the village had been waiting for this. They nod along, avoid eye contact, and agree. Yes, children are impulsive. They get lost. They forget the rules. But the truth is thick in the air, as heavy as the smoke from the last of the firewood. These children didn't run. They were taken by the cold, by the hunger, by someone who could no longer wait. The first time it happens, the mother screams for days. She combs the woods with torn hands and bloody feet. The neighbors join at first, out of guilt, not hope. But when they find nothing, not even a scrap of cloth, they retreat. They say it was wolves, that the storm came in too fast, that the child was too small to survive alone. The mother doesn't stop searching, not until she collapses outside her own door, her skin gray with frostbite and her voice cracked with silence. After that, no one searches again. The second child disappears more quietly, a boy with a cough who hadn't eaten in days. His father says nothing. just stares at the fire like he's waiting for it to speak. People leave him alone. They understand, or pretend to. Then a girl vanishes. A child no older than 6. Last seen outside her home chasing a dog that wasn't there. Her family says nothing. They don't cry. They don't ask for help. They just shut the door and do not open it again. The silence that follows is worse than mourning. It is complicity. At night, no one lets their children outside, not even to relieve themselves. They are kept close, wrapped in linens, hidden from the dark and the eyes that might be watching. But no lock is strong enough when the hunger grows sharp. One evening, a family wakes to find their door ajar and the cot empty. No prints in the snow, no noise, just gone. The mother says she was taken by spirits. The villagers agree. It's easier than the truth. Rumors begin to rot beneath the surface. Someone swears they saw a child's shoe near the mill, but it was clean, too clean, as if placed there, not dropped. Another finds bones in the ashes of a hearth. Tiny bones. Bird bones, they say. But everyone knows better. Even the priest stops preaching of sin. He only speaks of judgment now, and the ways in which silence can damn a soul as surely as a knife. No one names it. No one points. But they all understand what is happening. They ration their portions with guilt, not grace. They eat with their backs to the window. They speak softly, as if the walls themselves might tell the dead what they've done. In this famine, it is not the strongest who survive, but the ones willing to look away. And when the children vanish, they do not cry, they do not search, they whisper, they pray, and they wait their turn. He came at dusk, hunched beneath a dusting of snow, his breath misting the air like smoke from a dying fire. A lone traveler, gaunt, tired, and grateful to find signs of life in a place that looked long abandoned. His boots were cracked, his coat threadbare, but he carried the soft posture of someone not yet broken. Perhaps he thought the village might offer kindness. Perhaps he didn't see the way curtains shifted as he passed, or how no one came to greet him. The hunger had already rearranged the villagers' sense of hospitality. Strangers were no longer potential friends. They were opportunity. He knocked at the largest house, where the hearth still glowed behind shuttered windows. The family who lived there had once been generous, hosting pilgrims, feeding the poor during better times. But this winter had hardened them. Still, they opened the door and welcomed him in. He smiled, offered what little he had, a coin, a prayer, a story. They gave him stew, thin but warm. He ate quickly, not noticing the way the father watched him, not hearing the quiet shift in the floorboards overhead, not smelling the desperation clinging to the walls like smoke. That night, the traveler slept in the cellar. He thought it a kindness, warmer than the barn, safer than the road. He curled beneath a moth-eaten blanket and whispered thanks to the gods. But above him, the family did not sleep. The father stoked the fire. The mother peeled roots. The eldest son fetched something from the barn, eyes hollow and wide. No one spoke. They had already spoken enough before he arrived. His appearance hadn't changed the plan. It had only accelerated it. In the morning, the traveler was gone. At least, that's what they told the neighbors. He left before dawn, they said, took the road south. But no one had seen him leave. No footprints, no farewells, just silence. And when someone asked if he'd taken breakfast, the mother shook her head. He wasn't hungry, she said, with a voice like damp cloth. Said he had places to be. The villagers nodded. It wasn't their business. Everyone had secrets now. Everyone knew better than to dig too deep. especially in frozen ground. But some did wonder. The dogs didn't bark that night. The cellar door had been bolted from the outside. And when the snow melted weeks later, there was a patch of earth in the garden that seemed too freshly turned, too square. A child asked about it, was told it was for planting onions, but nothing ever grew there. The soil remained dark, rich, and untouched. Still, no one accused, not out loud, because the traveler had no kin, no name anyone remembered. He was a shadow on a road, a story without a beginning, easy to forget, easier to swallow. In a winter like this, strangers didn't just disappear. They became part of the village, in the soil, in the soup, in the silence that followed each knock at the cellar door. The bread didn't look like bread. It crumbled too easily, gave off no warm aroma, and left a bitter film on the tongue that no one could quite place. But it filled the stomach, or at least tricked it into silence for a while. And that was all anyone could ask. The flour had run out weeks ago, and what little grain had been left had long since turned to mold or mouse droppings. Still, the villagers needed to eat, and so they made do. They sifted what they could find: sawdust from chopped beams, dry leaves pounded into powder, and ash from the hearth scraped clean each morning. Then someone added something else: bones, ground fine as flour. It began with animal bones. Chickens, rats, cats, if one was unlucky enough to catch one. The marrow long gone, the flesh stripped. They were dried and crushed beneath stones. Mixed with ash, a pinch of salt, and whatever scraps of root or bark could be gathered, it formed a kind of dough. The ovens barely worked anymore. Most fires were too small, the wood too green, but with enough heat and time, the mixture hardened. It didn't rise. It didn't brown. But it could be sliced, and it could be chewed. That was enough. The first loaves were eaten with a kind of grim reverence. People joked that they tasted like the dead, and then stopped laughing when they realized how true that was. Because soon, the bones stopped coming from animals. The village had been too quiet for too long. No pigs in the pen, no goats in the field. And then someone remembered the ossuary near the chapel. Dry bones, human bones, forgotten bones. No names left, no families to care. Just brittle limbs and skulls gathering dust in shallow pits. And in the face of starvation, reverence gave way to rationale. Bones are bones. Protein is protein. No one admitted it, not at first. The bread was simply thicker now, heavier, the taste sharper. Children gagged, but were told to chew. Elders wept quietly, but kept their mouths closed. And when someone asked if the flour looked a little too gray, the baker shrugged. "Everything's gray this winter," he said. Even the truth. There was a kind of silence around the loaves. They weren't traded, they weren't shared outside the village. They were eaten quickly, eyes lowered, crumbs wiped away like a secret. But word spread, as it always does. A traveler mentioned them in another town, a story half told about bread that tasted like fire and teeth. The tale grew legs. By spring, it had become a legend, a parable about hunger and blasphemy. But in the village, they knew better. It wasn't myth. It was necessity. They hadn't baked horror to shock the world. They'd done it to keep breathing. And when the famine finally broke, when crops returned and food began to travel again, no one spoke of the bone bread. The ovens were rebuilt. Real flour came back. But even years later, in the quiet of their homes, some villagers swore they could still taste ash on the air, or crunch something sharp between their teeth that didn't belong. And they remembered the loaves, not as shame, but as survival in its most brutal, unforgiving form. The church bell rang every morning, like it always had, its hollow clang echoing across snow-covered rooftops and through the hollow stomachs of those who still believed it meant something. Faith was the last warmth many villagers had, a fire lit not with wood, but with hope. They clung to it, even as their fingers went numb and their children withered. The monks in the abbey, robed and holy, preached suffering as sacred and hunger as purification, but their gates remained shut, their larders remained stocked, and their words, once trusted, began to taste like ash. At first, the villagers accepted it. Of course the church was different, sacred, untouchable. The monks needed strength to pray on behalf of everyone else, but time wore down even the sturdiest faith. When a mother buried her third child, when an old man collapsed mid-prayer with no one to help him, when the graveyard filled and the church offered no aid, no bread, no shelter, not even last rites, something shifted. It wasn't outrage, not at first, just a cold, quiet betrayal that spread like frost. People began to murmur. Some said they saw smoke rising from the monastery kitchens. Others swore they smelled roasting meat. And while villagers gnawed on bark and boiled leather shoes, the monks walked the cloisters with full bellies and soft faces. Sermons continued, piped through the thick wooden doors. Endure, they said. Suffer with grace. But outside, grace was gone. All that remained was bone, frost, and the knowledge that salvation was being eaten behind stone walls. A boy disappeared after being seen knocking at the monastery gate. Just a child, too thin to be a threat, holding out a hand for food. The monk said he wandered off, but no one found tracks in the snow, and the dogs wouldn't go near the abbey for days afterward. Another villager, half mad with hunger, claimed she heard screams in the night echoing from the cloister courtyard, but she was ignored. Starvation, they said, made people hallucinate. Eventually, the village stopped sending their dead to the church for burial. The monks no longer came to bless the fields or the homes. They became ghosts, fat ghosts with the scent of meat on their robes. Someone etched a warning into the church door one night, using a nail and trembling hands. God sees through stone. The next day, it was scrubbed away, but not forgotten. And then, as hunger deepened and morality thinned, someone took action. No one knows who lit the fire first or who broke the gate. But one morning, the abbey was found ransacked, the altar overturned, the wine spilled like blood, and in the kitchen, bones, stripped, boiled, shattered, were left heaped in the hearth as if they too had once prayed. No monk was ever seen again. Faith, the villagers learned, could not feed you, and sometimes it was used to fatten others. The church had stayed silent when voices were most needed, and so the starving filled the void, not with hymns, but with howls. Long after the famine ended and the village began to repopulate, the well near the edge of the forest remained sealed, not with stones or mortar, but with stories. Children were warned not to go near it, not because of any curse or monster, but because of her. The woman in the well. That's how the tale began. Always whispered. Always with a glance over the shoulder, even on summer days when the fields were green again and bread was plentiful. She wasn't a ghost, they said. She was worse. She had lived through the hunger, and she had made plans. Her real name was lost or buried on purpose. Some say she was a midwife. Others say she was a widow with no family left. But all versions agree on one thing: she survived longer than anyone else should have. When the famine turned the village inside out, when dogs vanished, when children went silent, when even grave robbing had been exhausted, she kept going, pale, quiet, and always watching. She didn't beg. She didn't barter. She didn't waste time on prayer. Instead, she worked. It began with the snow thaw. That was when the first bodies were found, whole, unspoiled, preserved as if waiting for something. Not buried, not burned, just lowered into the icy darkness of the well, wrapped in cloth, marked with chalk, tagged like meat in a butcher's cellar. There were no bite marks, no butchering. But the implication was clear. She had saved them, stored them, not for burial, for later. The villagers who discovered the first bodies said she'd chosen carefully. The travelers, the strangers, the orphans no one would miss. Maybe a thief or two. No one too important, but people nonetheless. And when the villagers confronted her, when they gathered in the square and demanded an explanation, she did not deny it. She looked them in the eye and said calmly, "You think you wouldn't have done the same." They didn't burn her. They didn't kill her. The famine had taken that kind of fire out of them. They just locked her in the church cellar and stopped talking about it. She died the following winter. Some say by her own hand, others say by someone else's, and the well was sealed soon after. But the story grew. It spread beyond the village, became a lesson whispered in bad years when crops failed and rats grew bold. Plan ahead, people muttered, or end up like the woman in the well. No one knew if she'd ever actually eaten what she'd preserved. But that wasn't the point. The horror wasn't in what she did. It was in how close it came to making sense. In a world where the cold took everything and hunger made beasts of men, she had simply done what hunger demanded, quietly, efficiently, with intention. She hadn't been a monster. She'd just been prepared. And that was what terrified them most. The winter of 1348 was so cold the church bells cracked, pipes froze, animals died mid-step, and whole families huddled together in silence, counting the days with their breath. In the village of Saint-Germain, it wasn't just the weather that bit. It was the absence. No milk, no flour, no grain shipments, no word from the next town over. The snow had buried the roads, and the hunger had buried everything else. People grew gaunt. Eyes turned hollow. But one man still had meat. Martin the butcher had always been a steady presence in Saint-Germain. Square-shouldered, thick-bearded, hands like blocks of wood. Before the famine, he had run the busiest shop in town. Pork, lamb, sometimes rabbit. People liked him, trusted him. Even after the livestock died and the game vanished, Martin's shutters stayed open. A small queue would form outside his shop every few days, where the scent of stew still drifted through the frost. At first, no one asked questions, not out loud. People bought what they could afford: meat, seasoned oddly, wrapped tightly in cloth, and took it home. It chewed tough. It tasted unfamiliar. But it filled a hole, and that was enough. Until it wasn't. Rumors began the way they always did, quiet, uneasy. A girl noticed her neighbor hadn't been seen in days. A drunk swore he saw a boot in the butcher's refuse pile. A child found a finger bone near the woodshed. People whispered, but no one confronted. because confronting meant admitting they'd known, that they'd suspected, and that they'd kept buying anyway. Martin said nothing. He kept cutting, wrapping, selling. He worked by lantern light even when no one came. He didn't smile. He didn't hide. He simply offered the only thing the village still had, meat. And the hunger made cowards of them all. Eventually, someone broke. A widow, they say, whose son had gone to trade wood for food and never returned. She marched into the shop and demanded to see what hung in the back room. No one knows exactly what she found, just that she didn't come out for a long time, and when she did, she was holding her son's scarf. The townspeople dragged Martin into the square. No trial, no priests, just a rope and a torch. The shop was burned to the ground that same night. They said it smelled like pork, but the guilt clung longer than the smoke. Everyone had eaten. Everyone had swallowed the lie. And for years after, when meat returned and the snow finally ceased, they never looked at a butcher the same way again. In Saint-Germain, the hunger didn't just starve. It fed something darker. Martin hadn't crept through the village with a knife. He hadn't hunted his neighbors. He had waited. And when desperation knocked, they came willingly. Coin in hand, mouths open. Because the truth no one could stomach wasn't what he'd done, but how many of them had come back for seconds. The hardest part wasn't the killing, it was the boiling. That's what one witness said. An old woman who had lived through the famine of 1316 and outlived nearly everyone else in her village. She sat by the hearth in her daughter's home decades later, hands wrapped around a cracked cup, staring into flames that no longer reminded her of warmth. It was the sound, she said, the way the water changed when it wasn't roots anymore. Eyewitnesses rarely speak in clear terms when it comes to what happened during the Great Famine. The official records avoid it altogether. Monks wrote of unholy feasting and forbidden broth, but not the ingredients. The church had no appetite for those details. But buried in letters, diaries, and whispered accounts passed down like warnings, there are fragments. Recipes, if you can call them that. Instructions scrawled in desperation, passed between the starving not as blasphemy, but as knowledge. The last knowledge. You start with a pot, any pot. Fill it with water and heat it slowly so as not to waste wood. Add roots if you have them. Bark, moss, even leather. Boiled long enough, it softens. Then comes the meat. Not from an animal. Not anymore. The source is never named. He was old, is one account. She had no family, is another. We thought he'd wandered off. That one comes from a letter found decades later in a collapsed cottage, unsigned. Once the flesh goes in, everything changes. The smell turns sour, sweet, thick. One account describes it as like broth with teeth. Another says it reminded her of roasted goose, but heavier. They stirred slowly, carefully. One pot was flavored with wild onion, another with spoiled milk to cover the scent, and all of it was eaten. Not because they didn't know, but because they couldn't afford to care. Some added herbs not for taste, but to forget. A handful of poppy seed could make the meal feel less like a sin and more like a sleep. Others prayed before they ate. Most didn't. They sat in silence, bowls in laps, spoons trembling. The food didn't just fill their stomachs. It changed them. Their eyes turned inward. Their mouths forgot joy. The act of eating became survival, but not living. Never living. There were children who ate and didn't understand, elders who refused and wasted away. But for the ones who stayed, the ones who boiled and stirred and swallowed, they carried the knowledge. Not with pride, not even with shame, just with permanence, like a scar. Years later, when the famine passed and food returned, no one used those pots again. They were buried or broken. The hearths scrubbed clean. The recipes were never written down, but they didn't need to be. The survivors remembered every step, every sound, every sickening sip. Because once you've boiled the unthinkable, you never forget the steam. They found the first finger bone tucked neatly beneath a layer of salt in a wooden barrel behind the tavern. Pale, brittle, stripped clean, save for the nail, which curled in a way no pig's hoof ever could. The barkeep turned gray. The local magistrate ordered the barrel opened in full, and what spilled out wasn't just flesh, it was memory. Rotten, salted, human memory. The stranger had arrived in the dead of winter, cloaked, quiet, and carrying a wagon that creaked with something heavy. He claimed to be a hunter, said he'd felled a great boar in the lowlands and was traveling village to village, selling what he couldn't carry home. At first, no one questioned it. Who would? The snow had returned early that year. The fields were dead, the forests bare, and the livestock had long since thinned. When someone walks in with meat, you don't ask questions. You ask the price. He sold it by the slab. Thick, marbled cuts that sizzled on the fire and filled cold homes with the smell of something rich, something real. The tavern bought a barrel. So did the blacksmith's wife, and the widow who lived by the creek, and the miller's apprentice who fed it to his siblings without knowing. For a week, the village ate better than they had in months. Men smiled again. Children stopped crying at night. The stranger stayed 2 more days, drank little, slept in his wagon, and vanished without a goodbye. It was the seamstress who noticed. She said the meat looked wrong in daylight, too pale, too soft. The marbling was inconsistent. She'd seen pig flesh before, skinned it herself, but this was something else. She brought the last of her cut to the apothecary, who refused to speak of what he saw, only nodded once and walked straight to the magistrate. By the time they cracked the barrel, most of the meat had been eaten, but what remained was unmistakable. A forearm, thin and long, part of a thigh, fingers, preserved with care, trimmed cleanly, not butchery, surgery. Whoever had prepared it knew exactly what they were doing, and they'd done it for more than one body. Panic spread like frost. The villagers gathered and whispered accusations at the wind. Some tried to make themselves sick, clawing at their throats, praying to vomit up the crime. Others denied they had tasted it at all. One man took a knife to his own hand, swearing penance. A child was overheard saying it was the best meal she'd ever had. Her mother struck her for it. The magistrate ordered a search, but the stranger was gone. No wagon tracks, no campfire, just melted snow where he'd once parked. They say he left the village cleaner than he found it, emptier certainly. For years after, meat was feared, every cut inspected, every stew watched. People whispered of salted strangers and the taste that had haunted their mouths long after the hunger faded. They never found out who he was, but they all knew what he left behind. Hunger with a memory, and the knowledge that in the right brine, even horror can be preserved. It started with whispers, quiet exchanges behind the baker's kiln, inside the chapel's crumbling vestry, beneath the shadowed eaves where rats gathered for warmth. Hunger had emptied the granaries and silenced the livestock pens, but there was still meat, somehow. No one said how. No one asked. They simply passed the word, along with trembling fingers and coins, slick with desperation. There's a man in the alley behind the tannery. Bring what you have. He sells cuts. They called them flesh markets, though never out loud. To speak the phrase was to admit knowledge, and knowledge was as dangerous as guilt. These gatherings weren't markets in the proper sense. No stalls, no bartering, no public cries of price and weight. Just cloaked figures huddled together, eyes darting like hunted animals, waiting to exchange hunger for something bloody and unspoken. You didn't go for variety. You went for calories. You paid and took what you were given. A slab wrapped in cloth, a pouch that dripped. Meat. That's all you let yourself call it. The vendors rarely showed their faces. They came and went quickly, melting into alleyways, never selling from the same spot 2 nights in a row. Some claimed they were former butchers. Others said they were grave diggers, cut off from faith and now serving darker appetites. A few villagers whispered that the vendors didn't just sell the meat, they curated it, knew whose flesh was most tender, knew how long to salt it, knew how to blend it with root mash to mask the taste for those who couldn't yet bring themselves to eat it plain. And people came. Not just the desperate and dying, but the respectable. The clerk whose hands trembled as he passed a coin beneath his cloak. The baker's sister, her eyes rimmed with guilt and grease. The priest's servant boy, who wept as he carried home a cut for his master. These weren't criminals, not in their own eyes. They were just people with stomachs that refused to stop groaning, children who could no longer cry from weakness, husbands who would rather feed their wives forbidden flesh than bury another one. Some brought their own offerings, not coins but favors, old bones to be ground, cloth to wrap, silence, a name. Once, someone brought a body, small, still warm. The vendor didn't ask why. He simply gestured for it to be left behind the barrel and handed over a cut in exchange. No words, just business. These markets never lasted long. Rumors would swell. A neighbor would vanish. A magistrate's wife would notice a new smell in the air. And then, as quickly as they'd come, the vendors would disappear. The alley would go quiet. The whispers would stop. Until the hunger returned. Until the need became unbearable again. No signs were ever posted. No lists kept. But the knowledge stayed in the blood. Hidden behind eyes that had seen too much. In stomachs that still remembered the taste. In nightmares where you're handed a warm bundle in the dark and told only, don't ask, just eat. When the frost finally melted and the green returned, it should have been a time of rejoicing. Fields began to stir with life, rivers unclenched their icy jaws, and smoke curled again from chimneys, not for boiling belts or bark, but for bread. But peace did not follow. Relief arrived hand in hand with reckoning, and those who had endured the worst were not welcomed as survivors. They were summoned as suspects. The church bells rang not for prayer, but for judgment. Town criers announced inquiries. The magistrates, their bellies now comfortably full, emerged from cloisters and stone halls with scrolls and scribes in tow. What was once whispered in corners now echoed through courtyards. Lists were drawn. Those suspected of partaking in human flesh, those who had mysteriously prospered during famine, those whose neighbors had vanished without trace or grave. They called them bone eaters, not as a metaphor, but as a charge. Trials were held in open squares, with crowds gathered not to cheer or weep, but to stare. Some of the accused were dragged in trembling. Others stood defiant, eyes hollowed not from guilt, but from starvation endured and memory they could not scrub away. The testimonies were grim. A girl who said her uncle had fed her something strange that she later learned had fingernails. A neighbor who heard screams from a cellar. A widow whose missing child's bracelet was found in another woman's hearth ash. Judges demanded names, not just of the dead, but of the consumed. They spoke of desecrated graves, of missing beggars, of stew pots found with bones too small to be pig. The accused tried to explain. Some sobbed that they had no choice, that death had knocked first, and they answered in kind. Others denied it altogether, though their faces were sunken with the kind of guilt that never quite fades. Some begged for understanding. "I did it for my children," one woman cried. "They were dying. What would you have done?" The judge did not answer. Punishment varied. Some were banished, marked with ashes on their hands or faces so that all who saw them would remember. Others were locked in stocks, left for days as the village hurled rotted bread and screamed ghoul at their feet. A few were executed, not because of the act, but because of who they had fed it to. One man was hanged not for eating flesh, but for selling it as stew to the unsuspecting. His last words were, "They praise the taste." But perhaps the harshest sentence came not from the court, but from the people. Even those cleared of wrongdoing were not forgiven. Children crossed the street to avoid them. Shopkeepers refused their coin. They were ghosts among the living, those who had eaten death to stay alive. And behind the judgments, behind the thin veil of law and order, there was fear, because every accuser had also felt that hunger. Every juror had imagined, in their darkest moment, doing the same. The trials weren't just about justice. They were about forgetting. And no one forgets faster than the well-fed. They buried the truth beneath centuries of silence, but the records remain. In a cracked parish ledger, in a faded marginal note scrawled in haste, and in the stories grandmothers once told when the nights stretched too long and too quiet. There was a village, name long lost or deliberately erased, where the famine dragged on past any mercy, and where the man of God became the meat of man. The priest, they say, was the last to keep his weight. While the villagers grew thinner by the day, his cheeks remained round, his robes tight at the seams. He was fed somehow, and that became a problem. At first, there were whispers. Why did he still stand tall while others crawled? Why did his chimney always smoke? Why did the parish cat vanish the same week the priest claimed to have fasted in solitude? No one dared accuse him aloud, of course. He was God's representative. To question him was to question heaven itself. But hunger has a way of clearing the fog of reverence. And when a young mother was turned away from the church steps, her baby too starved to cry, something in the village cracked. They didn't plan it. At least no one ever admitted to planning it. But one night, the church doors were found open, candles lit, chalice overturned, the altar cloth soaked in something thicker than wine, and the priest was gone. The next day, no questions were asked, no funeral held. A new calm fell over the town, the kind of calm that only comes after a terrible decision has been made and carried out. They said he'd gone on pilgrimage, that he'd left to seek help, that he'd been called by a vision. But the truth seeped out, as it always does. Years later, a child, too young to know better, told a visiting friar about the stew with no bones, the feast where no one was allowed to speak, the night the hunger finally stopped. The friar laughed it off, but when he mentioned it at the abbey, a grim silence followed. An investigation was ordered. What they found was little more than rumors and a few terrified stares. But they exhumed the church floor anyway, and beneath the altar they discovered robes, torn, blood-stained, and buried with haste. No one was punished. The famine had long ended. Most of the villagers were already dead or gone. But the story spread, not as a warning, but as a legend. They say the priest's spirit still lingers in churches where the poor are turned away, where comfort wears a cross and charity is denied at the door. They say he watches from the rafters, listens from the pews, and if he sees injustice, he does not pray. The village was never named again. Its place on maps faded with time, but its shame lives on in hushed sayings and glances exchanged during lean winters. And every time a priest grows fat while his flock withers, someone remembers. They ate the priest, and for a moment, the hunger stopped. Candlemas was supposed to be a day of light, a brief spark of hope in the dead of winter, when the earth was still frozen, the granaries emptied, and the people gaunt from too many months of scraping pots and boiling bark. It was the turning point, the halfway mark between solstice and spring, when priests blessed candles to ward off the darkness, and villagers gathered in cloaks patched with hope more than thread. In years past, it had been a time of comfort, of warm bread, salted pork, and communal cheer. But that year, no pigs had survived the frost. The sheep had been butchered by autumn. The only meat to be found hung on bones buried shallow beneath brittle snow. And yet, on Candlemas, there was meat. The smell hit the village square first. Thick, rich, unmistakably real. It curled from the parish house chimney, drifted past the chapel's stonework, and made the children stop in their tracks. A stew, not one of roots or bark, but of flesh, fat and fragrant and impossible. People gathered without meaning to, drawn by the scent like moths to fire. The priest emerged with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and invited them in. "We have received a miracle," he said. "A gift from a neighboring abbey. A true blessing on Candlemas." No one questioned the story. They didn't want to. The tables were already being set. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the cold hall, bowls passed quickly, spoons clutched by hands that trembled not with fear, but anticipation. The meat was tender. The fat clung to the lips. There was a sweetness to it, a richness that made the weak moan in relief. No one asked what it was. No one dared. They just ate, swallowing both the stew and the lie it carried. And when it was done, they lit their candles, sang the hymns, and thanked God for sparing them, even as they tried to ignore the absence of the two men who had tended the church grounds only days before. The next morning, one of the altar boys whispered to his mother about a pile of clothes he'd seen in the root cellar, torn, bloodied, boots still laced. The story spread in fragments, too vague to accuse, too horrifying to confirm. The priest denied everything. "You question providence, Wu?" he asked. "Would you rather the children starved?" And what could they say? They were full for the first time in months. The children's cheeks flushed pink. The village, for one evening, had remembered the taste of life. Years later, no one celebrated Candlemas there. The date was marked by fasting instead of feasting. The church doors remained closed, but the smell lingered in memory. That terrible aroma of salvation. That feast no one spoke of, yet none could forget. In the end, it wasn't guilt that haunted them. It was gratitude. And that perhaps was the darkest part of all. She never gives her name, just calls herself the daughter, as if the title alone explains enough. When she speaks, it's barely above a breath, like she's afraid the words might still carry consequences, though the famine passed decades ago, and the church that once judged her has long since crumbled. Her voice is dry, papery, like the bones she used to carry. She doesn't cry when she tells the story. She just stares, as if remembering is more vivid than living. Her father had been a grave digger. Before the famine, that meant steady work and little notice. No one paid much attention to the man who dug the holes. But when the ground froze and the dead piled up, his job changed. Burials were shallow, shrouds were thin, and no one came to visit. The hunger was loud by then, too loud, and the graveyard was quiet, too quiet. The girl was small, just old enough to run errands, too young to understand shame. Her father would give her a burlap sack and a task. "Find the ones with fat still on them," he said once. She hadn't understood. Thought he meant bones for glue or trade or some peasant medicine. Only later did she notice the fire pit, the blackened pot, and the smell that clung to her father's clothes like sin. She did as she was told, dug with hands wrapped in rags, pulled back dirt and snow, cracked frozen wood, and peered into hollowed eyes. Some had only rags and bone. Some still wore faces. Those, she learned, were the ones worth taking. She dragged them by the ankles, careful not to look at their mouths, their hands, their rings. She wasn't stealing people. She was helping feed her brother, her mother, herself. They never cooked when the village was awake. Only late, when wind howled loud enough to mask the bubbling of the pot. The meat was shredded, stringy, always overcooked. They never spoke during meals. The silence wasn't reverent. It was survival. The girl learned not to ask, not to name, just eat, just sleep, just wake up and go again. Years later, when the famine ended and people stopped whispering about missing bodies, her father disappeared. No one came looking. She heard he'd fled to another town, changed his name, or perhaps he died the way many like him did, alone and buried deeper than most. She stayed, grew older, moved farther from the graves, found work, found quiet, but she never forgot. Now, she tells the story not to horrify, but to remind that hunger changes people, that survival comes at strange costs, and that sometimes the only thing separating a child from a monster is the man who hands her a sack. She tells her tale to those who will listen, not loudly, not proudly, but because the bones she once carried never quite let go. The scroll was discovered behind a crumbling wall in the monastery of St. Anduin, long sealed, long forgotten. Tucked between brittle prayer books and brittler bones, it was not catalogued by scribes nor listed in any index of sacred texts. Its author never signed his name, just a simple marking at the top, confession that it may not be forgotten. What followed was no sermon, no psalm. It was hunger, written in ink that had long since bled into the fibers of the parchment, part blood, part guilt, part something darker. The monk who wrote it began with silence. Not his own, but the world's. How the bells stopped ringing one winter. How the footsteps in the cloister grew fewer. How the hymns in the chapel gave way to coughing, then whimpering, then nothing at all. He described a cold that clung to the stones like a second skin, ice on the altar, snow in the apothecary, rats gone, cellars empty, and through it all, the unbroken rule of obedience: stay, pray, endure. He did, for weeks, fasting longer than was holy, slicing parchment into strips and chewing it for fiber, heating stones and pressing them to his stomach to trick the ache away. But prayers were thin things, and by the third month of famine, faith had turned to fever. He was not the first to break. That honor, he said, belonged to Brother Adric, the one who'd always smiled too long, lingered too close to the kitchen. The body they found in his cell wasn't a murder. Not exactly. Not in the way the world defined it. He wrote about the vote, if it could be called that, how the surviving monks gathered, trembling, eyes sunken, robes stiff with cold and filth. How they didn't argue, didn't even speak. They only looked at the body, then at each other, and bowed their heads in something between reverence and defeat. A pot was fetched. The fire stoked. The scroll does not detail the preparation, only the aftermath. Bowls passed with shaking hands, the silence deeper than prayer, the chewing slow, ashamed, grateful. That one meal turned into others. There were still bodies, when the monk wrote, some still warm. Guilt came later, he said. Much later. After the thaw, when carts came down the mountain again and bells rang once more. When supplies returned and salvation looked like flour and salt and strangers who didn't know what had happened in the crypt below. That was when the silence turned to sickness and the sickness to confession. He wrote the scroll knowing he would not be forgiven. I do not seek absolution, it ends, only memory, that we not be erased in silence. It was rolled, sealed with a wax sigil in the shape of a skull, and hidden away in a gap behind the sanctuary wall. Now, it sits in a glass case, labeled simply, Testament of the Famine Years. Most visitors don't read it. Fewer understand it. But for those who do, it whispers a truth deeper than doctrine, that even in holy places, the hunger howled, and men of God too have teeth. Long after the snow melted and the fields returned to green, the homes remained, silent, sagging, but still standing. These were the cottages at the edge of the woods, on the far ends of forgotten villages, where roofs collapsed inward like exhausted lungs and doorways tilted like bowed heads. Most were reclaimed by moss and bramble, but some still bore marks, strange ones, scratched into beams, door frames, and hearthstones. Not decorations, not Christian symbols. These were warnings left behind by hands that had nothing else to offer the future but caution. The first one was found by accident. A thatcher, repairing a roof long after the last famine, spotted it burned into a support beam, a crude image of a man kneeling, his mouth wide, with another figure cradled in his arms. At first he thought it was a prayer carving, but the more he looked, the more wrong it felt. The proportions weren't right. The position wasn't reverent. It was desperate, gut-churningly so. More were discovered in the years that followed, behind collapsed furniture, under floorboards, etched onto rafters, and even baked into the soot around old hearths. They varied slightly in shape and detail, but the story they told was the same: a house that had crossed a line, a place where hunger had devoured more than food. Some showed skeletal figures beside empty bowls. Others featured crude depictions of limbs, gnawed, parted, hung from hooks. One showed a family sitting around a table, heads bowed, with one seat conspicuously empty and a dark stain in its place. These weren't confessions. They weren't boasts. They were warnings, etched not in ink, but in desperation. Some believed they were meant to ward off future famine, like curses trapped in wood. Others said they were shame markers, left by survivors who couldn't bring themselves to speak, so they carved instead. We did this, the scratches seemed to say. Don't let it happen again. In time, the church condemned them as pagan graffiti. Some were scrubbed off, others buried beneath plaster and whitewash. But not all. A few remained untouched, protected by families who'd heard stories whispered from grandparents too ashamed to speak plainly. These carvings weren't spoken of in sermons or schoolrooms, but every child knew not to sleep in the old houses near the edge of the village. They called them cursed, haunted, marked. One carving, found inside the remains of a collapsed chimney, had a single word scratched beneath it, barely legible but unmistakable: enough. No context, no signature, just that. What compels a person to carve such things in the middle of a crisis? Is it guilt, fear, or the last remaining scrap of humanity? An instinct to reach forward in time and say, "We were here, this happened, beware." In a world without parchment, without ink, without the strength to speak, a knife and a beam were all they had. The carvings remain, weathered and fading. But if you look close enough, you can still see the hunger in the lines. Not the hunger for food, but the hunger to be remembered and not repeated. The Lord's collector rode into the village with his usual entourage, 2 guards, a scribe, and the leather-bound ledger that smelled of mold and dread. His presence always drew silent eyes from windows, cautious nods from doorways. But this time, the stares lingered longer, heavier. Winter had not merely overstayed, it had declared war. And the villagers, thin as their shadows, had little left to give. The grain bins were bare, the chickens long eaten, the goat had vanished weeks ago. What then could they offer in place of wheat, wine, or wool? The collector, unmoved, recited his list. 2 bushels from each household, a quarter flitch of meat, 1 jug of oil, or equivalent. His voice carried no cruelty, just expectation, like the tolling of a bell. Payment wasn't negotiable. To fail was to invite punishment not just from the steward, but from the structure of the realm itself. Taxes were sacred. The divine order flowed from the king to the Lord, and from the Lord to the fields. Break that chain, and the punishment was collective. But hunger had already broken the chain. And in desperation, something unspoken began to happen. The first offering came wrapped in linen, a tight, greasy bundle handed over by a widow with sunken eyes and trembling fingers. "Cured from last month," she said. The collector didn't ask questions. He sniffed it, frowned, and wrote it down. Next came a pair of smoked legs from a house known to have no livestock. The meat was pale, soft. The collector noted the weight and moved on. A slab of jerky, vaguely shaped, and a dried sausage of questionable origin followed. Soon, the tally for meat was met. More than met. He took it. All of it. And he left. Days later, rumors swirled. The collector had fallen ill. The scribe, too. One of the guards hadn't made it back to the manor. The ledger, when returned, was stained and torn, pages stuck together with something dark. The steward called it an outbreak, blamed rot or sickness carried in moldy barrels. But among the villagers, no one believed that. They knew. They had seen what was handed over, and they knew what wasn't spoken. "Tithes of flesh," one old man muttered. "Not from pigs, not from cows, from the missing." He wasn't entirely wrong. In the harshest corners of the village, behind the boarded windows, people had made calculations. A sick uncle who wouldn't last the week. A stranger who died quietly by the river. A runaway servant girl no one came looking for. Meat was meat, until it wasn't. And when survival dances too long with despair, the steps blur into madness. The next year, the collector returned with dogs. He didn't dismount. He demanded coin or grain. Nothing wrapped. Nothing smoked. Nothing from a cellar. And from that year on, the Lord accepted partial payments. Because even a nobleman knows, it's better to lose a coin than bite into something you can't forget. At the edge of the village, where the trees begin to reclaim the land and the road thins into mud, there stands a house no one visits. Not anymore. The roof has collapsed in parts, its thatch rotted into moss-covered clumps. The door, once reinforced with iron nails, now hangs half loose, swinging in the wind like a warning too stubborn to fall. And yet, the structure remains, whole enough to trap a smell that never left. A smell the villagers do not describe, not because they can't, but because they won't. It clings to the air like damp wool soaked in old blood, rancid fat, and something too human to mistake. No one lives there now. No animals wander near. Even the crows, those tireless opportunists, avoid the windows. Children are told stories about the man who once lived there, a tanner, a recluse, a survivor. They call him the skin stewer, though no one dares say if the name was earned or invented after. He came to the village during the second winter of famine, alone, carrying nothing but a sack and a look that spoke of places far worse than here. He offered to cure hides, trade in leather, help the village survive. And for a time, he did. Then came the noises. Boiling, always boiling, at all hours. Steam rising from the chimney, even on days when no firewood was to be found. A bubbling sound, thick and wet, that stuttered into the night like breath through phlegm. No one was invited inside, and those who knocked never entered. The man would appear in the doorway, his sleeves damp, his face ruddy from the heat. "Still working," he'd say, voice like a tired blade. "Still curing." Then came the smells. It started with a tang in the air, metallic, sweet, putrid, different from the scent of rotted grain or spoiled milk. Deeper. It curled into the nose and lingered behind the eyes. Soon, dogs began to vanish. Cats, too. One child said he saw the tanner dragging something into the house at dusk, something with fingers. His parents beat him for lying. The turning point came when a group of villagers, drunk and starving, decided to confront him. They found the door unlatched, the fire cold. Inside, the cauldron still sat in the hearth, half filled with a sludge so greasy and foul that one man vomited before crossing the threshold. Hanging from the rafters were skins, stretched, drying, human, small ones, adult ones, flayed clean. And on the table, a knife, a stained apron, and bones stripped with a precision no animal ever managed. He was gone. Some say he fled into the woods. Some claim the villagers caught him and buried him beneath the floorboards. Others say the house itself swallowed him, its beams steeped in his sins. But no one lives there. No one tears it down. Because you don't disturb a place like that. You let the rain rot it. Let the moss claim it. Let the wind carry its scent as quiet punishment. And you never, ever open the door. At first, no one questioned how she kept her fire lit. The village was freezing, barns were bare, and most homes had long since eaten their way through every crust and crumb, but the widow's chimney still smoked. Every evening, the smell of stew drifted through the frostbitten air, thick and warm, making mouths water and stomachs tighten with need. She didn't hoard, she shared. That's what made it worse in the end. She invited children in first, the ones too small to protest. Mothers thanked her with tears in their eyes, calling her a gift from heaven. "God has spared her larder," they whispered. And she, always quiet, always kind, never claimed otherwise. People began trading her candles, wood, even family heirlooms, just for a single bowl of soup. She accepted with a nod and never asked for more. Her house became a beacon, the last place in the village where food meant hope. Until spring, when the ground softened. That's when a boy chasing a dog stumbled on something strange behind her home. A stack of shallow mounds, barely concealed, half-frozen limbs sticking out like roots. The priest was called. The cellar was broken open. What they found turned stomachs colder than the frost ever had. Bones, dozens of them, small and split, some with butcher's marks. The pot was still warm on the hearth. The children never came back. And the widow? She was gone. The only sign she'd ever lived there was the scent of rosemary in the ashes and the silence that followed. No one speaks her name now, but every so often, a bowl is left at the church door, filled with stew. They weren't dug with ceremony. There were no hymns, no prayers, no weeping relatives clutching rosaries. Just trenches, shallow and hurried, carved into frozen earth with shaking hands and broken tools. These were not graves in the sacred sense, they were solutions. Problems buried quickly so they wouldn't stink, wouldn't speak, wouldn't remind the villagers of the hunger that made them monsters. The bone pits, as they came to be called long after, were hidden at first, behind barns, in collapsed cellars, in the woods where only children dared to play. The bones inside were not laid to rest. They were discarded, stripped, and snapped, the marrow long since sucked dry. Skulls with cleanly broken jaws, ribs bent backward, femurs split lengthwise. These weren't acts of reverence. They were acts of need. And yet, the village carried on. New seasons brought new crops. The famine passed. But the earth never quite forgot. Years later, when roads were expanded or foundations dug, workers would uncover them, nests of pale, porous remains, human and unmistakably tampered with, and always with the same disturbing pattern. No names, no markers, no cloth or trinkets. Just fleshless history, shoved into the dirt and hoped to be forgotten. But bones don't rot like memory. They persist. Children would dare each other to poke around the old fields. Dogs would come back with jawbones. And every so often, someone would find an old ladle or butcher's hook among the remains, rusted with time and guilt. The parish tried to sanctify the sites, sprinkling holy water and offering late prayers. But the earth stayed quiet. Not peaceful, just mute. Because these weren't honored dead. These were the ones no one wanted to remember. And yet they are the ones whose story lingers longest, unmarked, unblessed, and unforgiven. The fields bloomed again, but something had changed. The wheat stood tall, golden and swaying, as if nothing had ever gone wrong, as if the land hadn't starved and the people hadn't screamed. But beneath that gentle rustle, stories lingered, low and unsettling, like wind carrying secrets. Children born after the famine played near the edges of the village, laughing among the stalks, but the games they played weren't ordinary. They had strange rules, songs with twisted lyrics, rhymes no adult remembered teaching them. Run from the shadow that eats your name. It comes with hunger, not with flame. The parents said nothing. They heard the games, and their hands froze over their work, but they never interrupted. Because some of those parents remembered. They remembered nights when screams rose from neighbors' huts and no one checked. They remembered meat that looked wrong, cooked too long, and eaten too fast. They remembered the silence afterward. The children didn't know, couldn't know, but still the songs came, and the way they looked over their shoulders when walking home alone, as if something still watched them from between the stalks. The fields no longer bore famine, but they carried echoes, moments stitched into the soil like roots. And in the absence of spoken history, those echoes became lullabies, warnings disguised as play. A game of tag wasn't just tag. One child always had to be the hollow one, the eater, the chased and the chaser. It was make-believe, they said. Innocent fun. But the laughter always rang just a little too loud, and the endings never felt like victory. Visitors to the village noticed it too, how the children wouldn't go into the fields alone after sunset, how they left bundles of old bread near the scarecrow for the hungry ghost, how even the birds avoided nesting there. And still the wheat grew, golden and tall. But when the wind picked up just right, and the village was quiet enough, you could swear the fields whispered back, not in words, but in rhythm, in the cadence of a child's rhyme, a reminder that famine doesn't just empty bellies. It plants something in the soil, something that grows alongside the wheat, something that remembers. The broth had been boiling all morning. In a clay pot cracked down one side, suspended by blackened hooks over the hearth, it gave off the bitter metallic scent of root vegetables and old bones. The host, a gray-bearded man with hollow cheeks and eyes that darted like mice, stirred it with a ladle worn smooth by famine. He smiled too much, said too little, claimed the stew was rabbit, maybe dog. "Whatever you're lucky to have these days," he'd said with a shrug. The guest, a traveling peasant with frostbitten fingers and a growling stomach, asked no questions. Hunger had long since stolen his pride. He sat near the fire and accepted the bowl with trembling hands. The broth was hot and greasy, too greasy. The meat tore like it didn't belong in stew, but he chewed it anyway. Then something floated to the top, small, pale, familiar, a finger, human. Not shriveled like old meat. Fresh, the nails still intact, the skin puckered from heat. The peasant froze. He didn't scream, just stared. The host's smile didn't falter. "Must be a bone," he said too quickly. "Strange things boil up when it's lean." The peasant set the bowl down, stood, and backed toward the door. The host offered more stew. The peasant ran. He went to the parish, clutching the finger in a rag like a relic. The priest, weary-eyed and smelling of incense and rot, examined it with a shake of the head. "May not be what you think," he muttered. "These are desperate times." But he didn't call for a burial, didn't investigate. Instead, he took the finger and placed it in a box under the altar, locked it away with the calm of a man who'd seen far worse. The peasant wasn't so calm. He didn't eat for days. Every meal brought back the image, the soft curl, the knuckle, the nail. He left the village, walking through frost and sleet, vowing never to speak of it. But stories like this don't need retelling to survive. The next traveler avoided that house, then the one after. The host's fire still burned each night, stew still boiling, but fewer guests arrived. And eventually, none. The priest stopped mentioning him in services. No prayers, no visits, no inquiries. And when the man finally vanished, whether from exposure, guilt, or justice, no one mourned. The house remained, blackened by smoke and silence, the stew pot still hanging by the hearth. In spring, a child dared enter and found it dry, cracked, and empty. But when he looked inside, he claimed he saw scratch marks, fingernail grooves. Just one, but enough. When starvation stretched past prayer and into madness, even the scriptures grew elastic. In hushed corners of candlelit hovels where the wind howled through cracked shutters and the church bell no longer rang, villagers told stories not found in any Bible. These were the tales of the cannibal saints. Whispered at night, these stories blurred the line between legend and loophole, justifications dressed in sacred robes. Saint Pelagia ate her brother to survive the siege, one woman murmured to her children as they cried from hunger, and she was blessed for her faith. Saint Ulfric boiled the flesh of fallen monks, another added. He wept as he did it, but heaven forgave him. No such saints existed, of course, not in Rome's records, not in illuminated manuscripts, but that didn't matter. Desperate people invent desperate theology. These tales were soft psalms for the stomach, permission cloaked in reverence. They offered a way to endure what could not be spoken of, let alone justified. And slowly, those stories spread like fire through dry fields. People wanted to believe them, needed to. It wasn't always clear whether the villagers truly believed in these sacred cannibals or if they simply chose to. In one village, a crude painting appeared in a shrine, an emaciated man haloed in gold, weeping as he held a femur over a pot. The caption was carved in rough Latin, Deus vult etiam in carne, God wills it, even in flesh. Pilgrims did not flock to it. There were no miracles, but offerings were left all the same, dried bark, buttons, a child's doll with no arms. Enough to show it mattered. The local priests denounced it as heresy, of course, but their words carried little weight when they were the only ones still eating well. Locked behind monastic doors, they preached abstinence while feasting on salted pork. So the people turned inward. The sacred became local, God became a face in the stew pot, and saints became men who had once sinned just enough to survive. There's no record of the cannibal saints in any official doctrine, but that's the point. The famine rewrote the gospel in flesh and smoke. It wasn't about faith, it was about the permission to keep breathing, even if that meant lying to God, or pretending God had lied first. And long after the famine faded, these whispered gospels lingered, embedded in lullabies, proverbs, and warnings. Even saints were hungry once, mothers would say. So don't judge what you can't stomach. It began with a sound no one noticed, silence in the pens. The usual grunts and squeals of the pigs had faded. At first, villagers thought it was the cold, or that the animals had huddled deeper into the hay. But as the frost thickened and hunger sharpened its claws, the real reason became clear. One by one, the pigs were vanishing. No tracks, no blood, no explanation. Just empty troughs and trampled straw. Farmers whispered that foxes had grown bold, that wolves had come down from the hills. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. It wasn't beasts dragging pigs into the dark. It was neighbors. The pigs were the first to go, then the chickens, then the goats. The cows lasted longest, not because they were loved, but because they were harder to kill quietly. But starvation teaches silence. By midwinter, the barn stood empty, cold as crypts. And with the animals gone, the hunger turned inward. Eyes lingered too long on the elderly. Children were no longer allowed to wander. Every visitor was watched closely, not for what they brought, but for what they might take. One woman swore she saw her neighbor carrying a sack that twitched. A man found his chicken coop door open, but no footprints in the snow, except his own. Another woke to find a rope missing from the barn and meat boiling next door by dawn. They didn't confront each other. They didn't need to. The understanding was unspoken and unbearable. There were no screams, no public accusations, just the slow disintegration of trust, like frost eating away at stone. And when spring finally crept back into the world, it brought no joy, only dread. Because now, with the snow melting, the buried sins would begin to rise. Bones loosened from shallow graves, scars visible beneath half-frozen soil. The pigs were long forgotten. Now the question was, who had eaten and who had been eaten. And in that awful clarity, another silence settled, heavier than the last. This one didn't come from barns or fields. It came from the people, because the pigs had been food. But the people were memories. And memories don't rot, they haunt. It began with the smoke, thin and gray, curling from chimneys when no one expected it. Most hearths had gone cold by midwinter, the firewood long since burned, the stoves used more for prayer than for cooking. But every now and then, in certain homes, you'd catch the scent of something that didn't belong. Not burning peat, not bitter roots, but something richer, oily, sweet even. It clung to the air like guilt, and people noticed. They didn't speak of it openly at first. They exchanged glances, widened their nostrils at the waft on the wind, and carried their suspicions back to their frozen blankets. But hunger has a way of sharpening attention. When your own pot boils with bark and shoe leather, the scent of meat, real meat, is a cruel betrayal, especially when no livestock remains, especially when no guests have arrived, especially when the children next door have stopped crying. A widow, long known for her quiet nature, is seen carrying buckets into the woods and returning empty. A family that once begged now eats in silence behind shuttered windows. The smoke keeps rising. No one is invited. The curtains never part. One man dares to ask. He approaches a neighbor's home and comments politely about the delicious smell. The woman smiles, but doesn't answer. Her eyes are hollow. Her hands tremble around the ladle. She offers nothing, not even a lie. He does not ask again. Soon, rumors grow louder than the hunger. She's feeding them something unnatural. He went out at night and came back with red on his boots. Their cellar hasn't been opened in weeks. But rumors remain whispers, because to accuse someone of that, means bringing darkness into daylight. And daylight in winter is short. Some neighbors disappear. Others fall silent. The smoke continues to rise from certain hearths, defying frost, defying morality. But no one knocks anymore. The scent is a warning, a ward, a scream that no one dares to echo. When spring thaws the snow and men finally step into those homes again, many are already abandoned. The pots are cold. The hearths are dark. But the smell lingers, sweet and sour, soaked into the stone itself. And in some kitchens, bones are found, small ones, broken, burned, hidden under floorboards, behind chimneys, in ash heaps, too neatly swept. No names are ever spoken, no charges are brought, but the village remembers. Every hearth with strange smoke becomes a story. Every meal once refused becomes a confession. And from then on, smoke means suspicion. Warmth means worry. And the only fire that comforts is the one no one sees. It was supposed to be just another butchering. The last cow in the village, skinny from months of shared grain and weak from the cold, was brought to slaughter not as livestock, but as a relic. Its owners cried when it was led away, but they had no choice. There was nothing left to eat, and the cow itself had nearly starved. The butcher, too thin for his apron, didn't look anyone in the eye as he raised his blade. In lean times, rituals become rushed. Even sacred animals lose their mystery when hunger takes hold. He opened the belly, expecting half-digested straw, stones, and maybe a few swallowed rags, desperate meals for a desperate beast. Instead, he found a molar, human, still intact, wedged inside a mass of gristle and bile. He stopped, dug deeper. More fragments followed. A fingernail, a clump of hair, no clothing, no bones. just the evidence of someone who had passed through this cow in pieces. There was no accident here. Cows don't scavenge corpses. They don't gnaw at remains or root through graves. This cow had been fed something. Someone. And now that someone had come back up, not through a voice or prayer, but through rot and proof. The butcher said nothing at first. He wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced behind him, half expecting someone to be watching. No one was. The village was too quiet. He wrapped the meat as usual, sold it by the cut, and went home without tasting any of it. That night, he dreamed of chewing, endless chewing, and blood on his tongue that wasn't his. Word spread anyway. The butcher hadn't meant to speak, but fear makes mouths move. He told the priest. The priest told the reeve. The reeve told no one. But the rumor left his house before he did. By morning, the village whispered about the cursed cow, and by noon, no one would touch the meat. It was all dumped into the river, though not before one boy said he saw his neighbor gnawing a rib and smiling. What troubled them most wasn't that someone had fed the cow a human body. It was that they didn't know who. No one had reported a missing person. No one dared to ask if it had been someone local or someone passing through. The cow hadn't wandered into the woods and found the flesh. It had been given it, piece by piece, with hands and intention. After that, the butcher didn't butcher anymore. He locked his knives in a chest and moved into the church to sleep. He claimed he could still smell the tooth when he closed his eyes. Not rot, not blood, just enamel. Cold, ancient, and wrong. The villagers never slaughtered another animal, not for years. And if they did, no one looked too closely at the stomach. Not after what the cow had digested. Not after what they'd all nearly swallowed. They were sung softly, not as laments, but as lullabies. So the children wouldn't cry from hunger, and the old wouldn't wake in terror. No names were ever mentioned, only metaphors. In times of plenty, you might mistake the verses for poetry, but anyone who lived through the black winters knew better. These were not songs of comfort. They were memory in disguise. Meat of sorrow, one ballad crooned, in a key as cold as January, seasoned by tears and sweetened by sleep. The lines repeated gently, like a cradle swinging in the dark, but the weight behind them was heavy. Everyone knew what the meat was. Everyone knew whose sleep had sweetened it. In a village where words could betray you to the gallows, song became a shield. There was a melody about the broth that blackened our bowls, its minor chords hiding the truth that it wasn't barley or beans turning the stew that color. It was marrow, cooked down to nothing, served in silence. Another ditty spoke of the quiet feast, where even the dogs sat still, because the dogs, too, were gone. No one dared ask where the songs came from. Some claimed they were made by widows, humming to themselves as they stirred pots that no longer smelled of herbs. Others said the tunes came from the dead, whispered through chattering teeth before breath gave out. There was even a tale of a mute girl who sang one night after her entire family vanished. Her song became the chorus of the Bitter Supper, a hymn that now haunts winter firesides across 3 counties. The ballads were passed like heirlooms, polished in performance, worn with grief. You couldn't outlaw them. Priests tried. They called them blasphemy, sin, reminders of mankind's fall. But villagers kept humming, especially when the nights grew cold. It was easier than speaking, easier than confessing. Sometimes, strangers would arrive, hear a song, and smile, until they caught a phrase too odd to ignore. The feast where fingers fed the flame, or the laughter that licked the bone. Then the smiles faltered, and the questions began. The locals always shrugged. Just old songs, they'd say. Nothing but superstition. But deep down, everyone remembered. The verses weren't superstition. They were survival encoded in rhyme. A way to share guilt without choking on it. A way to mourn without naming names. And still, to this day, in certain valleys, if the winter lingers and the frost refuses to break, you might hear them again. A cracked voice by a hearth. A child humming into straw. A woman stringing syllables into a tune no one taught her, yet somehow she knows. Because songs last longer than confessions. And sometimes the only way to live with what you did is to sing it sweetly and pretend it was just a dream. They called her the Mother Butcher, though she had no husband and only one child left to bury. In the beginning, they'd called her something else entirely, Saint Magda. When the village rationed their last sack of barley, when even the dogs were being shared in silence, she somehow kept a pot boiling. Every day. Steam rose from her chimney long after the rest of the homes had gone cold, and when her neighbors came knocking, drawn by the smell, she never turned them away. She ladled thick stew into trembling hands and told them it was turnip, root, squirrel if she was lucky. Her guests didn't ask too many questions. Hunger doesn't bargain with morality. They ate. They thanked her. Some called her an angel. Others muttered prayers outside her door. She became a lifeline, a miracle in skirts, and for a while, hope had a flavor. But the thaw came early that year, and with it, a loosening of secrets buried under snow. A pair of boys playing near the woods stumbled on something pale beneath the wet loam, a femur, clean, save for the scrape marks along its length, too large for any animal. They thought it was ancient until they found the boot still clinging to the lower half. Word spread fast, as it always does in small places where shame is just another mouth to feed. The Reeves sent men to dig beneath her garden. They found more. A dozen bodies, or what was left of them. Some guests, others beggars, and at least one traveler no one had missed until now. Bones scorched and broken, teeth piled in sacks, tucked neatly behind her stove, flesh long gone, but not forgotten. Magda didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at them as they led her to the village square, her hair tied back, her wrists bound with rope that once hung meat to dry. The priest asked if she had any final words. She said only this: "I fed those who were hungry. I did what none of you would." No one replied. They hung her from the gallows beam used for thieves. Her child was taken in by the Reeves' wife, who never once let him near the kitchen. No one spoke Magda's name again, not even her neighbors who had licked her bowls clean and come back for seconds. They swore they hadn't known. Maybe they hadn't. But in that village, long after the snow melted and green returned to the trees, no one ever boiled stew again without glancing at the window. No one shared a meal without first counting the heads at the table. And when children asked why the gallows still stood, the old ones would shake their heads and say, "It's not for justice, it's for hunger, should it ever return." Because in the end, it wasn't the famine that took St. Magda. It was the taste of salvation, and the price it finally demanded. The storm had swallowed the road for days, erasing all trace of where the path ended and survival began. Snow piled so deep it blanketed entire fences, swallowed rooftops, and silenced forests. It was then, in the dead white hush of that impossible winter, that travelers stumbled upon the cottage, a stone home tucked against the hills, chimney puffing faint smoke, its shutters glowing with firelight, a miracle in a sea of death. The family who lived there, An older couple with a mute son welcomed the first group with open arms. Bread was broken, blankets shared. Word spread across the mountains. More came. Worn villagers, merchants, a fleeing friar, each turned away by snowdrift and hunger, each taken in by the same warm hearth. It was as if Providence had carved out a single mercy in the shape of that house. Hospitality in the truest sense. But spring came, then summer, and no one returned. Years later, when the famine was nothing but memory and war had moved on to other valleys, a pair of tax collectors passed the old route. They found the cottage abandoned, half buried in bramble, windows cracked, door hanging askew. Curious, they entered. The hearth was still blackened with soot, the table set as if a meal had been left mid-course. A spoon dropped on the floor, but it was beneath the stones of the hearth that they found the truth. Bones, dozens, long and small, some charred, others cleaved with marks that told no tale of accident. Fragments of skulls, children's ribs, jawbones mixed in with firewood. The mute son was never found, nor the couple. The villagers who'd disappeared had names in ledgers but no graves. No one could say exactly how many had vanished. No one could recall if they'd seen smoke for 1 week or many. The fog of famine had made everyone unreliable historians. Rumors spread that the couple had struck a deal with the devil, that they'd once been innkeepers turned murderers, that the son had spoken only once in his life, while chewing. The house was razed not long after, not by decree, but by fear. No one wanted to pass it again, and even the land, they say, refused to forget. Crops wouldn't grow where the foundation had been. Animals avoided the clearing, and every winter, without fail, a faint chimney of smoke was said to rise from the empty air. Travelers now take detours. Old maps bear a blank patch where the path once lay, and among certain mountain folk, there's a saying spoken low over fire. Hospitality is warmest when the guest never leaves. It's meant as a warning, because in the worst winters, kindness isn't always what opens the door. Sometimes it's just the bait. They clawed at the frozen ground long after the soil stopped giving. Nails split, fingers bled, but still they dug. Because somewhere beneath the frost was the last thing that wasn't meat, the bitter root. Twisted hard and nearly inedible, it became the line between salvation and surrender. And like all things too harsh to love, but too necessary to abandon, it became holy. No one had worshipped vegetables before, not like this, but when stew pots turned from bark to bone, the discovery of a single root was a miracle. The old woman who unearthed one from behind the chapel was treated like a prophet. They boiled it for hours, scraped the bark, peeled it by firelight. It fed 7. They called it God's finger. That night, no one went missing. Soon, rituals followed. Children were sent to forage not with baskets, but with whispered prayers. When one returned with a satchel of wild tubers, the village rang the church bell. They knelt in the frost and thanked the ground. Bitter roots were tied in bundles and hung from doorways like talismans, not because they were delicious, but because they were not human. It wasn't just food, it was penance. The more bitter the taste, the more it cleansed. Mothers forced it into their children's mouths like a sacrament. Some claimed it dulled the dreams, the ones where teeth crunched, and loved ones screamed with silent mouths. Priests began adding grated root to communion bread. Sermons praised the humility of the harvest over the temptation of meat. A new theology was born, not of abundance, but of abstinence. And still, the irony remained. The root that saved them also scarred them. It tore up bellies, caused fevers, and in some cases, killed the weak. But unlike the other meals, the secret ones, the shamed ones. This death was clean. It carried no shame, no whisper. If someone died with a root in their stomach, they were mourned properly, buried with hymns, remembered with candles, not silence. Years later, when the famine passed and the earth began to give again, a strange thing happened. No one wanted the sweet things. Apples, honey, berries, people ate them, yes, but without joy. It was the bitter roots they returned to, boiled, salted, stewed into paste. Not because they needed to, but because they remembered. And remembering was part of the cost of surviving. In one village, they still hold a winter festival. They cook the foulest root they can find. They eat it in silence. They do not season it. Children are told it's a lesson in humility, but the elders know better. It's a ward, a spell against forgetting, against hunger, against what comes when the root is gone and only each other remains. So they chew, they gag, they give thanks, and they pray that bitter is the worst they'll ever have to swallow again. It began not with an oath, but with a burial, quick, unmarked, under the frozen floor of a communal barn. The ground was too hard to dig deep, and the body too familiar to look at for long. No priest was summoned. No scripture was read. Just the scraping of shovels, the murmurs of frostbitten lips, and the quiet decision that this would be the last time anyone spoke of anything. What happened that winter would stay buried, like the man they covered with hay and silence. The pact spread without ceremony. There were no meetings, no written laws, just glances, just the understanding that they'd all seen too much, eaten too little, and crossed lines that no spring thaw could ever wash away. Mothers stopped asking where their children had gone. Neighbors stopped commenting on strange smells. Even the priest, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stopped preaching. When a man tried to confess, the priest simply shook his head and told him, "There is no forgiveness for what was necessary." Years passed. The village recovered, outwardly. Crops returned, goats bred again, and the well no longer ran dry. But laughter never did. Births were rare, songs even rarer. Children grew up in silence, taught not only to tend the fields, but to avoid the old cellar by the chapel, the barn that was never reopened, the stories that made the elders flinch. And then the carving appeared. It was found on a slab of stone near the edge of the woods, an ancient boundary marker, long unused. No one claimed to have made it, but someone had. It was etched with care, each letter scratched deep, not with artistry, but with need. The words weren't names or dates, just a list. Short, stark, familiar. The missing, the remembered. And next to each, a mark. 3 slashes if the person was mourned, a cross if they were forgiven, a blank space if not. The carving split the village like a crack through ice. Some wanted it destroyed, calling it a curse that would bring watchful eyes and sharpened laws. Others wept in relief, seeing in the stone a kind of gravestone for the sins they'd buried in their stomachs. The priest said nothing. He just began to attend the boundary again, kneeling before the slab each morning, whispering prayers not found in any book. To this day, no one knows who carved it. Or maybe everyone does, and they've all chosen silence once more. Outsiders pass through the hamlet now, remarking on how quiet it is, how strange the looks, how cold the hospitality. They never stay long. The villagers are polite, but distant. They do not tell stories. They do not explain the stone. But every winter, fresh candles are placed beneath it. And every spring, the names remain untouched. Not forgotten, just unspoken. Because in that village, survival came at a price heavier than flesh. the weight of remembering, without ever saying a word. She was born in the darkest part of winter, when the river had stopped flowing and the bread had long since become bark. Her mother died before naming her, and her father, mute with grief and madness, refused to speak. The midwife, trembling in the corner of that cold stone room, wrapped the baby in a threadbare shawl and whispered the only word that seemed to suit her arrival: hunger. The name was never written, never blessed, never spoken above a whisper, but it stuck, as if the world itself had marked her. Hunger grew up on stories that no one told. She learned early that questions were punished with silence, and that some rooms were never opened. Her meals were always modest, but strangely varied. While other children had boiled roots or hard grain, Hunger's bowls were deeper, richer, always just enough, never too much. She asked once where it came from. The woman who raised her only said, "From the past." Hunger never asked again. Villagers feared her in the way they feared the memories they had swallowed. Her eyes were too wide, too knowing. Her smile, rare as spring thunder, made people shift uncomfortably. When she walked through the market, old women clutched their baskets tighter. Children didn't play near her. Men blessed themselves under their breath, because deep down they knew what she represented. Not evil, not even guilt, but survival. Hunger was living proof of a bargain everyone wanted to forget. As she grew, she became strangely strong, not in muscle, but in resilience. Illness passed her by. Winter chills never seemed to touch her skin. Animals, especially the dogs that had returned to the village, avoided her entirely. One child swore he saw her feeding something behind the old chapel, something that shouldn't have had eyes. When the elders finally died off, one by one, quietly, their secrets sealed in empty homes, Hunger remained, young, unaged. She tended the graves. She kept no livestock, grew no crops, and yet always had enough. Some said she was cursed. Others believed she was a blessing in disguise, sent by God or fate to remind them what they once did. She never corrected either version. One spring, a new famine threatened. The clouds stayed. The rain didn't. The fields began to yellow. People grew desperate, panicked. They came to her house, begging, weeping, offering coin, work, prayer. She opened her door without a word and welcomed them in. What happened next, no one truly knows. Some say the famine passed miraculously. Others say those who entered never left. Hunger's home still stands, a little too clean, a little too still. Smoke rises from its chimney, even in summer. She is seen, occasionally, on the hill by the stone marker or by the river that flows again. Her face never changes. Her name never softens. And when strangers ask what it means, the villagers offer no answer, because they know the truth. That some children are born not from love, but from need. And sometimes, need never dies. They called her a witch, though she never cursed a soul nor summoned spirits. She lived alone, past the edge of the forest, in a crumbling cottage that smelled of cedar and broth. Her name was Alraune, though few used it. Most just whispered the witch and spat afterward. She was old, yes, but not bent. Her eyes were sharp, her hands sure. She brewed teas for fevers and poultices for burns. People came to her when they were desperate and never thanked her when they left healed. When the famine worsened, suspicion bloomed like mold in a damp root cellar. Food vanished, and so did people. The villagers came to her door, not with coin or questions, but with torches. They demanded to know what she had been feeding on, how she still had strength in her limbs, color in her cheeks. She stood in her doorway, arms folded calmly, and said, "I feed no one but the dead." They took it as a confession. Dragged into the village square, she did not weep. She did not plead. Instead, she told them plainly, the bodies they feared to touch, she had burned. She had buried. She had boiled, to clean the bones, to make space in the frozen ground. They were already gone, she said, and someone had to tend to them. The priest turned pale. The baker's wife fainted. The crowd roared with outrage, but also with something quieter, guilt. And yet they did not stop. They searched her home. In the low light of her hearth, they found her great black stew pot. A layer of fat clung to the rim. Floating in the cooled broth, among the bitter roots and wilted greens, was a single knuckle bone. Human, too clean, too fresh. They had found their evidence. She watched as they upended the pot and dragged her back into the snow. I fed no one but the dead, she said again, almost gently, as if repeating a prayer. They built the stake. They lit the flame. She did not scream. What remained of her was buried on unconsecrated land. No stone marked her resting place, but the stew pot remained, stored in the village chapel as a cautionary relic. For years it sat there, a dark basin of shame and doubt. Visitors sometimes claimed it still smelled faintly sweet, even dry, a mixture of herbs and something else. And yet, long after her death, villagers told different stories by candlelight. Some said she had saved them, boiled the dead so the living would not starve. Others said she had fed the healthy so they could go on pretending nothing had changed. No one could agree, but no one ever claimed she lied. In time, hunger faded, crops returned, the land healed, but the memory lingered. Children dared each other to touch the stew pot. No one ever did. And deep down, everyone remembered the truth. In a winter of secrets, the woman at the edge of the woods had spoken the only honest words. I fed no one but the dead. It began with the thaw. Snow melted in thick sheets, sluicing from rooftops and hillsides, soaking the ground until it could take no more. The river, once a gentle vein through the village, swelled with mud and memory. It burst its banks like a wound reopened. Water surged into homes, barns, and fields. People cursed and scrambled to higher ground. But the real horror wasn't in the flooding. It was in what the water carried. Bones, hundreds of them, pale, smooth, picked clean by time, but not forgotten. They surfaced in fields where wheat was meant to grow. They snagged in fishing nets. A child found a jawbone in her garden. Another uncovered a skull tangled in reeds, its teeth still clenched, still bearing witness. At first, people muttered about ancient burials, Roman soldiers, or plague pits, but they knew better. Everyone did. The village had a story it didn't tell. A winter that no one marked on paper, but everyone etched into silence. The flood forced it back into light. Elders grew pale and quiet. The miller, now half mad and blind, simply wept when he saw the bones. The river remembers, he said over and over. Others denied knowing anything. They blamed the flood for stirring things that should have stayed buried, but some began whispering about the last feast, the night when the starving were promised salvation, and only a few ever left the gathering. A few brave souls dug deeper, quite literally. Near the old chapel, where the river carved a new path, they found a pit lined with bones stacked neatly, too neatly. There were no coffins, no grave goods, no prayers, just the remains of at least 20 villagers, interred as if discarded. One skull had a clean hatchet mark through it. Another was missing its jaw entirely. These weren't plague victims. These were something else. When the priest was asked to sanctify the remains, he refused. Some things, he said, God turned his face from. He then quietly packed and left the village, never to return. A young boy later found his Bible buried under a loose floorboard in the vestry. The final page was torn out. A council was held. Some villagers wanted to rebury the bones. Others said burn them. Still more wanted to let the river take them. But no one agreed, and the bones remained where the flood had cast them. Like driftwood from a shipwreck, the village had never admitted boarding. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a scar. The earth was different now, heavier, darker. Crops grew slow and bitter in the field where the bones had risen. Children stopped playing by the riverbank, and every spring, when the snow began to melt, villagers held their breath, because the Red River ran again, and they feared what it might remember next. Lent came as it always did, 40 days of prayer, restraint, and hunger. The village prepared for it solemnly. Bread grew thinner, soup clearer, and the smell of meat vanished from the air. Or it should have. But that year, something was off. The parish bell still rang. Sermons were delivered. Yet from one crooked lane on the village's edge came the scent of roasting flesh. Thick, savory, unmistakable. The family at the edge of the wood had always kept to themselves. They were neither poor nor rich, neither generous nor cruel, just quiet. The father, a stoic man with hands like roots, claimed to have found a stash of smoked boar in his late uncle's attic. Enough to get them through the season, he said. Enough to be shared, even. But he never did. The smell of his meals curled out through the shutters, taunting the starving faithful. Meat. Real meat. During Lent. Rumors stirred like broth. How could they eat so well when the rest of the village boiled stones and pretended they were stew? One child said she saw the family's youngest son dragging a sack through the woods, something limp flopping inside. Another swore she watched them bury something near the tree line one dawn, quick and quiet like shame. When the priest came to investigate, he was turned away politely but firmly. Private mourning, the father said. Lost a cousin to the cold, praying through it in solitude. The priest left uneasily. That night he fasted harder than usual, unsure what weighed more on his stomach, emptiness or suspicion. The weeks passed, ash turned to passion, and still the scent of roasted meat lingered. Some began calling the lane Blessed Hollow, half mocking, half envious. A few desperate villagers even begged the family for scraps. They were refused with tears and apologies, though a thin dog was seen licking something red near their back door not long after. When Easter came, the family brought no eggs to market, no bread, no ham, nothing to celebrate, they said. Too much grief. But their cheeks were fuller than anyone's, their skin unpale, their firewood always stacked high. It wasn't until midsummer that anyone dared dig. The old dog led a boy to the woods, pawing at a mound near the roots of an ash tree. The boy uncovered bone, then more, then a skull, small, child-sized, with a broken jaw and a rosary still looped through its ribs. The village fell silent. Some demanded justice. Others prayed for the family's forgiveness. But no one ever confronted them. By autumn, their house stood empty. No fire, no scent, no trace. Just shutters banging in the wind and a single crucifix nailed to the door. Now each Lent, the village fasts with double rigor. No exceptions, no indulgences. And when someone eats too well, too quietly, they whisper about Blessed Hollow and the secret feast that fed more than just a family. The ruins were nothing special at first glance, just another collapsed cottage on the outskirts of a village that barely survived its own past. Moss crept along the stones, wildflowers grew where floorboards once lay, and children, as they always do, turned decay into a playground. It was a place for dares, for ghost stories, for throwing rocks at nothing. Until the wall cracked open. It happened during a game. A boy, chasing another, slammed into the brittle plaster. It crumbled like dust. Behind it, embedded in the dark clay, were dozens of small, pale objects. At first, they thought they were seeds or beads, but the girl with the sharper eyes picked one up and screamed. It was a tooth, not a fossil, not a wolf's. A human molar, baby-sized. Parents dismissed it. The village had seen wars, disease, collapses. Maybe a dentist's pit from the old days, someone joked. But no one could explain why the teeth were embedded so carefully. Not scattered, not dumped. Pressed into the wall like offerings, like a mosaic of hunger. When they returned to dig, more appeared. Canines, incisors, some whole and others cracked at the root. The wall behind the fireplace was full of them, layer upon layer. A silent gallery of mouths that no longer spoke. The priest was called. He blessed the site, sprinkled water, then quietly urged the villagers not to dig further. Some things are better left under God's mercy, he said. But curiosity gnawed at them like famine at the ribs. And someone did dig, deeper this time, behind the foundation. They found no skulls, no full skeletons, just more teeth and strips of cloth, child-sized tunics, scorched bones that never made it to burial, and a single iron spoon melted at the bowl, as if it had been held too long over fire. One old woman finally spoke. She had been a girl when the black winter came. Her mother warned her never to go near the fireplace. That's where they hide the shame, she'd whispered. The girl hadn't understood then. She did now. It became known as the Wall of Teeth. No plaque was hung. No memorial was made. The children stopped playing there, and the rubble was quietly cleared. Not razed, not rebuilt. Just removed, as if the village had exhaled something foul and now didn't want to inhale again. In hushed tones, parents tell their children to keep their teeth when they fall out. Don't lose them, when they say. Don't bury them. Don't burn them. And never, under any circumstance, hide them in the walls. Because teeth don't rot. They outlive famine, fire, and even forgetting. They remain to tell the truth when the rest of the body has long been swallowed. The salt barrels were meant to preserve life. In a world without refrigeration, without guarantees, they were the village's hope in wooden form. Heavy casks packed with coarse crystals, hiding slabs of meat meant to last through the bitter months. Pork mostly, sometimes venison, if the hunt was good. A goose, if luck and feathers aligned. But when the black year descended, even salt could not sanctify what came next. It began with whispers, long after the famine had passed. Survivors, older now, more brittle in bone but heavier in memory, started to talk. Not to confess exactly, but to release pressure. To whisper in corners of taverns when the fire was low and the ale too weak to silence the past. They spoke of barrels kept, not in the smokehouse, but in cellars sealed with rope and stone. Barrels that didn't smell right. Barrels that were never tapped in daylight. One man remembered a neighbor who always had stew, even when the snow sealed doors shut and no game dared breathe. He said the salt meat he traded had no bones, no rind, no marbling, just long, lean cuts, pale and tight-grained. Tasted like pork, he admitted, but pork doesn't scream when it's salted. Another spoke of a woman who kept to herself and sold salted strips in muslin bags. From her cousin's boar farm, she claimed. But she had no cousins and no pigs. When the famine lifted, her garden bloomed again, but her cellar remained locked. Years later, the boards rotted. What was found inside sent the next priest into permanent retreat. Some stories came from accidental discoveries. Children playing in ruins stumbled across barrels buried beneath collapsed sheds. The brine still wet, decades later. Bones bobbing inside. Not pig, not deer. Finger bones. A tooth wedged in the seam. Hair trapped in the slats like seaweed in driftwood. And always, that reek, not rot, but time. The kind of smell that even salt couldn't kill. One tale told of a merchant who survived by traveling from village to village during the famine, trading salted meat. He was always fed, always welcome. He said little. When he died, old and round, they opened his storeroom and found no receipts, no butchering tools, just maps marked with dots. Each dot a place that remembered his visits with unease. No one ever found his supply chain. Salt was survival, but it was also silence. Salt preserved not only the meat, but the secrets. No one asked too many questions during the famine, and when spring returned, so did denial. Better to believe you ate something you couldn't name than something you couldn't live with. Today, in some of those villages, salt is still bought by the sack. But no one keeps barrels in the cellar. No one salts in silence. And if you ever open one and find something wrapped too tightly, smelling just a bit too human, you don't tell anyone. You reseal it, and you pretend it never happened. Just like they did. The dogs came back with the thaw, slinking between the trees like shadows with teeth. Years had passed since the famine. Crops grew again. Bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. Children were born who had never gone to sleep hungry. But the land remembered. And so did the animals. They arrived first in ones and twos, mangy things with matted fur and too bright eyes. Survivors of the wild winter packs, or perhaps descendants of them. No one knew. They circled the edge of the village, sniffing the air with cautious reverence, as if returning to a sacred place. Or a slaughterhouse. People welcomed them at first. Dogs were good luck, companions, protectors. Most of the old ones had been eaten anyway, vanished when the snows came and the meat ran out. So when the new dogs arrived, some offered scraps. Let them sleep in the barns. Let the children name them. Then came the incidents. Chickens went missing. Then goats. Then a boy, barely 5, playing too close to the woods. They found his shoes, just the shoes, on the path. And paw prints. But not in retreat. They circled. They waited. Old villagers grew quiet. They knew something was wrong. Not just hunger in the animals' eyes, but recognition. A kind of awareness that made even the bravest men grip their tools a little tighter at dusk. Then one woman, widowed during the famine, swore she recognized one of the dogs, not by look, but by behavior. It barked the same way her husband's hound once had. It limped with the same leg, and it wouldn't stop staring at her door, night after night. The story spread. More dogs arrived. Not hunting in packs, but watching. Always watching. They didn't attack in daylight. They didn't snarl. They just waited, as if expecting something, or someone. A priest tried to bless the paths. Holy water, prayers. But dogs aren't bothered by God. They're bothered by memory, by smell. And these dogs, it seemed, had known the scent of cooked flesh. One evening, an old man was found dead outside his cottage. No wounds, no struggle, just gone. What was left of him, they said, was mostly bone, his meat eaten clean, as if the dogs had waited for him to lie down and stop fighting. After that, the village posted guards, killed any dog that came too close. But the unease remained, because the hunger that once drove man to feast on man had also fed the beasts. And hunger, unlike man, does not forget. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it returns on four legs, with wet noses and quiet footsteps, reminding the village that they weren't the only ones who feasted during the dark years. They still whisper his name in the farthest corners of the forest, where moss thickens and light dies young. He was once a woodsman, strong and kind, with a wife he loved, and a home of split logs and laughter. But the famine showed no mercy. His traps emptied. His axe grew heavy. And his wife, once so full of life, began to wither like the rest of them. They had no children, no neighbors close enough to hear their prayers. Just hunger. And time. The legend says it wasn't madness that drove him. Not entirely. It was silence. The sound of her breath thinning out beside the fire. The sound of his own stomach turning in on itself. And the storm that trapped them in for days, with nothing left to eat but memory. When they found him, weeks later, he was sitting at the hearth, gaunt as a corpse, gnawing on a femur. His wife's femur. There was still a ribbon in her hair, coiled neatly near the stove. And though he didn't run, didn't resist, his eyes were not right. They were hungry, desperately, endlessly hungry. The village didn't know what to do. They couldn't execute him. He had already punished himself. Couldn't forgive him. He had eaten forgiveness. So they exiled him. Sent him into the woods with nothing but his clothes, a walking stick, and the bones of his wife tied up in a sack. That should have been the end. But then came the sightings. A hunter swore he saw a man deep in the pines, gnawing bark like it was meat. A child claimed an old man had offered her squirrel stew, and when she refused, he whispered, "You've got your mother's flavor." Livestock disappeared. Smoke curled from caves no one dared explore. And the stories grew teeth. They say he never felt full again. That something inside him had broken. Something that could no longer be satisfied with food meant for beasts. The hunger had changed shape, become a curse that clung to him like skin. He ate rats, deer, tree roots, moss. He ate the bones of the dead, gnawed them into powder, licked it from his palms like flour, but still he starved, always starving. Children are warned, don't follow the smell of meat in the woods. Don't answer if someone calls your name in a voice too soft, too polite. Because the bone chewer still wanders, ribs like blades beneath a coat of rags, eyes sunken deep. And if he finds you, he won't eat your flesh. He'll eat your hope, your peace, your future, one bite at a time. Because some hungers are never cured. They rot in the soul, deeper than the stomach. And once you feed them, they feed on you, forever. There's a village so far removed from the world that even the maps seem to forget it. Nestled in the bend of an old, fog-thick river and surrounded by woods that always seem just a little too quiet, this place keeps to itself. It's not unfriendly, just private. Travelers are rare. When they do come, they leave quickly. sometimes with polite excuses, sometimes in the dead of night. But all of them remember the same thing: the soup. Every home serves it. Not always at once, but eventually, if you stay for more than a day, someone will ladle it out. Pale gray broth, thick as porridge, speckled with herbs and odd grains. It smells faintly of onion, but something else lurks beneath. Something earthy, metallic, familiar in the way nightmares sometimes are. And no one ever calls it by name. Ask what it is, and the answer is always the same. Old recipe. Push further, and their eyes dart away. Hands grip spoons tighter. Mouths flatten. Just soup. You'll get used to it. The children grow up eating it. They're not forced, it's tradition. They're told it's lucky that it kept the ancestors alive, that to waste it is to bring back the black years. Elders stir it slowly, lovingly, with worn wooden spoons that never get washed. The flavor, they say, is in the memory. Some stories whisper that during the worst winters, when no meat could be found, something else filled the pots. Something that used to talk and walk and pray. And that in time, that flesh softened into habit, boiled down into silence, changed into just soup. One visitor, a scholar tracing the roots of regional folk cuisine, stayed long enough to take notes. He sketched the kitchens, the bowls, the odd repetition of serving it on the third night. But after tasting the soup, he crossed out nearly every word he'd written. He left the next morning without a goodbye, left the sketchbook behind. The last page was a scribbled sentence, nearly torn into the paper. It's not what it tastes like, it's what it remembers. There are no cookbooks, no recipe cards. The ingredients are passed down orally, but always with substitutions. You'll know what to use, they say, like it's in the blood. And maybe it is, because the villagers live well, too well for their isolation. There's a glow in their cheeks, even in lean seasons. No one begs, no one starves, and no one ever forgets the soup. Not because it tastes good, but because it tastes like survival. So if you ever find yourself in that village, if the river fog lifts and the path leads you there, be polite. Eat what's given. Smile. Compliment the herbs. And when they offer you a second bowl, say no, because no one ever asks for thirds. He was once just a man among many, thin, tired, but unremarkable. A woodcutter, perhaps, or a shepherd. No one remembers for sure. But what they do remember is the veil. Always the veil. Its rough cloth, stitched by hand, the color of old milk and mud. It covers his face from brow to chin, fastened behind his head with fraying cord. He speaks through it, eats behind it, breathes as if it's the only thing keeping him intact. Children whisper he never takes it off, not even to sleep. He came back from the famine a different man. Gone were his brothers. Gone were his neighbors. His house still stood, though the roof sagged and the hearth lay cold. When others returned to rebuild, they found him already there, clearing debris in silence, face hidden. At first, they thought it was illness, a lingering plague perhaps, or a disfigurement from disease. But no, he wasn't sick. He was ashamed. He never spoke of what he'd done, but everyone had their theories. His farm was too remote for help to come, and winter was long. There were signs, bones found in the ashes, a single boot half buried in the garden, the absence of a younger cousin who once lived with him. When someone asked, once gently, if the mask was for protection, He answered only, "It's to keep my face from remembering." The village allowed him to stay. No one wanted to press too hard. After all, many had stains they could not scrub. But his guilt was too loud, even when unspoken. He avoided gatherings, never joined in feasts. At church, he knelt in the back with his head bowed low. Children dared each other to lift the veil. None ever succeeded. Years passed. New families moved in. The war came and went. The famine became legend. But the man with the mask remained, growing older, thinner, quieter. A living ghost among them. One winter, a fire took part of the village. Several homes were lost. His was spared. But for the first time in decades, he spoke loudly, offering shelter, food, warmth. He opened his home to those in need. He fed them soup. He smiled through the veil. Some wondered if he was trying to atone or if he missed the company. Then one night, he vanished. The house was found empty, the bed untouched. Only the mask remained, folded neatly on the table, a single bone placed beside it. A finger bone, clean, white, and worn at the joint. Not buried, not hidden, just offered. No one searched for him. No one wanted to. They let the house rot. They let the mask turn to dust. But they still tell his story. Not as a warning, not quite as a curse, more as a reminder that some faces are too haunted to be seen again, and some appetites, once fed, wear a veil forever. He arrived just as the frost returned, bundled in patched robes with a wooden cross slung over one shoulder and a wild fire in his eyes. The villagers didn't trust outsiders anymore, not after everything, but they let him speak, if only out of curiosity. He called himself Brother Elias, no surname, no parish, no proof of ordination, just that voice, low, magnetic, rising like thunder from a cracked sky. He didn't offer comfort. He offered conviction. What happened here, but he told them, was not fate. It was judgment. They listened in the half-collapsed chapel, bundled in cloaks and clutching themselves against the cold. He said the famine had not been an accident. He said the hunger was sent by God, not to punish their bodies, but their souls. You ate each other, he bellowed, because you forgot how to kneel. Some wept, others left, but many stayed. Desperation wears down doubt, and even shame finds shelter in the promise of purpose. He quoted scripture they didn't recognize, spoke of plagues that consumed the sinful and fires that purified the flesh. He named no names, but his eyes lingered too long on certain faces. He called them survivors, but only in the sense that God wasn't finished with them yet. Repent, he said, and you may still be forgiven. But first, you must confess. That night they fed him, not out of generosity, but fear. A full plate, boiled grains, roots, and something dark and stringy. No one asked what it was. He blessed the food, smiled with cracked lips, and ate with relish. Even the cursed deserve one last meal, he said. Then he wiped his hands, rose, and walked into the darkness beyond the chapel, saying he would pray alone in the forest. He never returned. They searched for him the next morning, out of habit more than concern, but the snow had erased his footprints, and no one found a single shred of fabric or bone, just the cross, buried halfway into the frozen earth like a warning, or a grave marker. In the weeks that followed, some claimed they saw him again, a silhouette by the tree line, a shadow outside a window. a voice in the wind reciting verses they still couldn't trace. The village grew quieter after that. No one preached, no one confessed, and the chapel doors froze shut. Years later, when new settlers came, they found the church still standing, untouched. Inside was a single wooden bench, a frost-covered altar, and a painted message scrawled on the far wall in blackened pitch. Feed not the prophet who names your sins. No one knows who wrote it. Some say Brother Elias was a madman. Others say he was an angel of vengeance. But the oldest villagers, those who remember the taste of despair, still shudder when winter falls hard. They do not speak his name. They do not build fires near the forest. And they never, ever leave a stranger unfed. He was half dead when they found him, curled up near the edge of the woods, more bone than man, his lips blue, his breath shallow. The famine had already hollowed out the village, left it gray and brittle like the frost on the eaves. But something about him stirred their pity. Maybe it was the way he clung to life, or the faint whisper of please he breathed through cracked teeth. Whatever it was, they carried him in, wrapped him in wool, and lit what little firewood they had left. For the first day, he said nothing, only groaned, slept, and drank whatever broth they spooned into his mouth. By the third day, color returned to his cheeks. By the fifth, he sat up, his eyes dark and alert. He thanked them, each one by name. That's when the unease began. No one had introduced themselves. No one had spoken their names aloud, but he knew them all. The widow with the limp, the blacksmith's son, the girl who never spoke since the river thawed red. He knew things no outsider should. He said he'd been there before, during the darkest weeks, but not as a guest. You don't remember me, he said, but I remember the cellar. Faces stiffened. Someone dropped a ladle. A man stood and left the room without a word. You thought I was dead. Maybe I was, he said calmly. I saw the pot. I saw what you did to the boy before me. Whispers started up again in the village. The elders said to ignore him, that hunger plays tricks, that there were no cellars, that he was raving. But at night, doors were double barred. Meals were eaten in silence. The traveler didn't accuse anyone directly, but his presence was accusation enough. He sat in the square each morning, wrapped in the very cloak they had offered him, smiling faintly as villagers passed. You did what you had to, he would say. I forgive you. But forgiveness, they realized, is a terrible kind of memory. Some begged him to leave. Others offered bribes. One man tried to drive him out with an axe, but the traveler didn't flinch. You don't get to choose who remembers, he told them. By spring, he was gone, vanished again into the woods, leaving only a shallow fire pit and a trail of uneaten food. But his absence didn't bring peace. It brought dread. Children whispered about him. Travelers claimed to see him in other villages, always thin, always smiling, always remembering. In time, the villagers began leaving food at the edge of the forest. A bowl of broth, a crust of bread. Not for thanks, but in fear. They had once pitied a stranger and saved his life. And now, the memory of that kindness haunts them more than the famine ever did. She was only a girl when she first heard the whispers, stories about her grandfather, the butcher with steady hands, and a quiet house at the edge of the village. People said he was a good man, a provider. His shop had remained open when every other window was boarded shut, when the famine turned bread into currency and meat into myth. But they never looked her in the eye when they said it, and when they passed his house, they crossed themselves or crossed the street. Years passed. The girl grew into a woman. The village rebuilt. New roads paved over the old trails. But the silence remained. Her parents never spoke of the famine. Her mother wept when she tried to ask. Her father changed the subject, always with a clenched jaw. So she stopped asking. Until the day the storm came. The old butcher's house had long been abandoned. Rot had claimed the beams. Moss grew over the lintel. But when the wind howled hard enough to peel the roof like an eggshell, the past spilled out. Inside, beneath a loose floorboard, she found it. A small, wrapped parcel. Oilcloth, soaked, dark, with time. She opened it carefully, reverently, like unwrapping a relic. It was a bone, small, smooth, and unmistakably human. A child's femur. Beside it, a bundle of letters, faded ink in her grandfather's hand. Not confessions exactly, more like records. Names, weights, dates. Annalise, tender, 4 loaves. Margot, strong flavor. 6. Her breath caught. The paper fluttered in her shaking hands. It wasn't just hunger that had haunted the village. It was organization, trade, calculation. She didn't know what to do with what she found. Burn it? Bury it? But something stopped her. The silence had survived too long. And so, she brought it to the church. Not to accuse, but to reveal. She laid the bone on the altar. The letters beside it. They held a meeting the next night. Packed into the town hall, all generations present. No one denied it. No one claimed ignorance. Some wept. Others simply nodded, as if they'd waited years to hear someone finally say it out loud. She didn't read the letters aloud. She didn't need to. The truth was already known. What mattered was that someone said it. The next spring, they built a small monument. Not a statue, just a stone, unmarked, planted at the edge of the butcher's property. A place to remember what they once did, and what they chose, at last, not to forget. The butcher's granddaughter still lives in the village. She doesn't speak often about the famine, but when she does, she starts with the same words. I never hated him. I just needed to know. And sometimes, at night, she swears she hears footsteps on the old butcher's floorboards. Not ghosts, just memory. Finally, walking free. It began with the plow catching something solid, a dull clink, then another. At first, the farmer thought it was gravel, nothing unusual after a long winter. But as the metal teeth of the blade pulled through the frost-cracked soil, they began to catch more frequently. The earth refused to turn over cleanly. It fought back. When he paused to look, what he found was not stone. It was enamel. Dozens of them. Human teeth, small and white and scattered like grain. He kept digging. By noon, he had uncovered a patch the size of a cartwheel, filled with molars, canines, incisors, some still lodged in fractured jaws. Others scattered freely like seed. There were too many to count, too many to explain. No full skeletons, no graves, just teeth, hundreds of them, pushed deep into the earth like the soil had been fed. The village priest came. Then the constable. Then the oldest woman in the village who stood in silence and refused to cross the field's threshold. She knew, or remembered, or feared remembering. This land had once been fallow for generations, never tilled, never touched. People said it was cursed, that nothing grew right. The trees near its edge always leaned away. Animals avoided it. And now, after so many years, the earth was giving up its secret. No one could say when the feast happened. The records were long lost, and the dead were silent. But the evidence remained. Teeth do not rot like flesh. They endure, like guilt. Some speculated it had been a mass killing during the famine years, outsiders perhaps, or children taken when the village was at its weakest. Others whispered that it had been a chosen ritual, a feast sanctioned not by desperation, but by decision. A communal silence followed the harvest. Everyone knew and no one spoke. They'd chosen survival, and this was the price. But who could prove it now? Still, stories began to circulate. Farmers refused to work the field. Children dared each other to run through it at night, but most wouldn't. One boy came back white-faced, saying he heard laughter under the dirt. The field was eventually left untouched, returned to its silence. But it remained a scar on the land. Every spring, the rains unearthed a few more teeth. Villagers began to gather them, placing them in jars left at the edge of the field, like offerings or apologies. Some said it helped. Others believed it only stirred the past further. No monument was built, no names were carved, but everyone knew. The field of teeth had no dates, no epitaph, only a silent truth. This was not just a place of death. It was a place of memory buried so deep, only the ground dared speak of it. They were not rich, not by the old standards. Before the famine, the Brune family was modest, 5 in total, the father, mother, 2 sons, and a daughter barely grown. They kept chickens, a goat, and a tidy vegetable patch behind their home on the village edge. Nothing extravagant, just enough to live and trade. But when the frost came early and the grain wagons stopped arriving, everything changed. The livestock vanished, the neighbors' gardens froze, the market stalls stood empty. Everyone suffered. Everyone except the Brunes. They did not starve. As others withered and rationed bark broth, the Brune hearth still crackled. The smoke from their chimney smelled of meat. Not every day, but enough to be noticed. Their cheeks stayed fuller than others. Their children did not cough themselves hoarse at night. Some thought they had preserved more than they admitted. Clever, perhaps, or just lucky. Others suspected theft, but no one dared confront them. Hunger makes cowards of saints. The rumors grew with the snowdrifts. A widow claimed she saw the eldest Brune son dragging a sack the size of a body. Another swore she found a smear of blood along their fence. The priest urged calm, insisting famine breeds slander. But unease clung to the village like smoke. Then spring came. The thaw brought swollen rivers and green shoots and silence from the Brune house. No chimney smoke, no children's laughter, no fresh footprints in the mud. Curious, a few brave villagers ventured to the doorstep. The door was ajar. Inside, the hearth was cold, the table bare, the beds untouched. Every drawer had been emptied. There was no sign of struggle, just the absence of life, as though the entire family had stepped out mid-meal and never returned. But the cellar told another story. Its latch was secured with a heavy stone, but when moved, it revealed something worse than rot. Bones, not buried, just stacked, some with teeth marks, others split open. Skulls, small and large, not 5, but many. Too many. The Brunes hadn't survived the winter by luck. The village reeled. No one spoke for days. When the constable returned from another town to investigate, the cellar had been burned. Not just the bones, but the entire home. Someone wanted the evidence gone, or perhaps everyone did. The Brunes were never found. Some claimed they'd fled into the forests. Others believed they were taken. by guilt, by spirits, by something older than justice. The truth, like so many in those years, vanished with the snowmelt. But the land where the Brune house once stood remained bare. No one rebuilt there. Crops refused to grow. Animals balked at its soil. Children dared not play near the ruins. And every spring, when the wind changed and the rivers whispered, the villagers remembered the family who ate too well. They never said their names aloud, but they always looked over their shoulders, just in case the Brunes ever came back hungry. It was decades after the famine had ended that the cellar was uncovered. A crumbling cottage at the forest's edge had finally collapsed under its own weight, revealing its foundation to a new generation of builders. The laborers came with carts and tools, eager to clear the wreckage and raise something new. But as they tore up the floorboards, one of them shouted, then went silent. What they found wasn't just an old root cellar or forgotten pantry. It was a room arranged with deliberate, eerie care. At the center sat a skeleton, upright in a wooden chair, long rotted through at the joints, but still unnaturally intact. Its hands rested on the table, fingers splayed. A cracked bowl sat in front of it, and in the bowl, a small femur, too small to be the skeleton's own. Bones were arranged around the room in patterns that mimicked a feast. A tibia stuck from the hearth like a cooking spit. Rib bones framed a plate like cutlery. Skulls, all mismatched, were stacked in a corner with their jaws open as if in laughter. And the skeleton itself, its jaw slightly parted, teeth bared in something too wide to be rest. Not a grimace, not a scream, a smile. No documents were found. No heirlooms. No clues of who had lived in the house. But locals remembered the stories. They whispered of a man who survived too many winters, who never invited guests, never appeared at the church, and whose chimney smoked even in the hardest months. When neighbors knocked during the worst years, no one answered. The snow on his roof never melted, except right above the kitchen. Some claimed it was his own twisted confession, left for posterity, a final supper with those he'd consumed. Others saw it as a mockery, one last laugh at the village that suspected but did nothing. Still others believed he hadn't staged it himself, that someone else posed him there, a punishment for what he'd done, a tableau of judgment where the dead stared forever at the evidence of their appetite. The authorities arrived, cataloged what they could, then sealed the cellar again. Too much decay, too many questions, too few answers. The skeleton was buried in unconsecrated ground, far from the village cemetery. The house was razed, nothing was rebuilt. But even now, some villagers say if you walk past the ruins on the coldest night of the year, you can hear the creak of a chair, the faint clink of bone on ceramic. And if you dare to look in through the frost-touched window, you'll see it, the faint grin of a skeleton who never truly left the table. The chimney had long since cooled, its hearth crumbled, the bricks black with time and smoke. No one had used the fireplace in generations, not since the famine years when the cottage last held life. When a new family purchased the land, they planned only to renovate, a fresh start. But as the chimney sweeps ascended to clear out the flue, their tools caught on something that wasn't soot and wouldn't budge. The brushes scratched bone. At first, they thought it a bird. Chimneys often became nests for the unlucky. But what they dislodged wasn't feather or twig. It was a tiny arm, curled into itself, hidden behind a loose stone. Work stopped. The bricks were carefully dismantled, row by row. And there, inside the wall, crouched within a space no larger than a barrel, were the remains of a child, still clothed in a tattered shift, knees drawn up, skull tucked into its own chest as if bracing against cold or fear. The room fell silent. The sweepers, once joking, now solemn, made their reports. Word spread fast. Not because death was rare, but because this one was hidden, secreted away as though the child had not simply died, but been erased. The locals whispered. Was it starvation? A hiding place turned tomb? Or something far darker? Older villagers remembered rumors. During the famine, some homes became traps. Families turned inward, paranoid, feral with hunger. Strangers vanished. Children went missing. Some said the child had been put there to protect it, hidden from raiders or desperate neighbors. But the absence of any attempt at rescue, no effort to retrieve or even mourn the body, suggested otherwise. There were marks on the walls inside the chimney. Not symbols, scratches. Shallow at first, then deeper, then desperate. The soot above them ran thick, as if smoke had mixed with panic. No one could say how long the child had survived there, how long they had screamed into the bricks. But their presence lingered, pressed into stone. When the bones were removed and the chimney rebuilt, nothing could quite cleanse the air. Fires never caught the same way again. Ash fell heavier. Guests swore they heard small knocks in the flue, like tiny fingers tapping from the inside. And in the dead of night, when the wind howled just right, the chimney moaned, not like a draft, but like a sigh. They say the famine claimed many in that village, but not all were taken cleanly. Some were walled in, silenced by family or fear. Some didn't die of hunger. They died of being hidden from it. And though centuries passed, the smoke still carries their echoes. There's a hush that hangs over the oldest parts of the village, the kind of quiet that doesn't simply suggest absence, but remembrance. Where weeds grow around crumbled stone foundations and the wind threads through blackened rafters, there is no one left to speak of what happened. And yet, the dead remember. Beneath floorboards, behind hearthstones, under fields now green with wheat, lie the remnants of those who endured hunger so profound it twisted the shape of morality. But they are not just victims. They are witnesses. For centuries, bones have surfaced where no graves were marked. A thigh bone among potato rows. Teeth caught in the roots of old trees. Every time the earth shifts, it yields up another piece of the truth. One no one wanted written down. These were not always the bones of the honored dead. Some were discarded, hidden, used. And yet, they outlasted shame, denial, and even memory itself. What do the dead remember? Not the horror in isolation, but the reasons. The slow descent into madness was not theatrical. It was quiet, deliberate, built on days without bread and nights without warmth. A father who could not feed his children. A mother who boiled grass. Neighbors who stopped knocking. Prayers that echoed off stone and returned empty. And then, when everything else ran out, the impossible choice. But the dead also remember the silence that followed, the silence of those who survived, too afraid to speak, and those who rebuilt, too ashamed to remember. Generations passed, stories softened, then disappeared, but the bones stayed. They do not forget what hands did to them. They remember the last touch, the final grip, the way light disappeared behind cellar doors, and how hunger made monsters of good men. And yet, in their stillness, there is something else: endurance. They are proof of what people will do to survive not just cold or famine, but erasure. For all the shame that blankets their story, there is also defiance in their persistence. You are hearing them now. Their tale was buried, but it was not silenced. It waited. For you. For anyone willing to listen without judgment, to understand without flinching. This is not a ghost story. It is a human one, about what it costs to live through the unlivable, about how even the worst parts of us are born from something desperate, not evil. And as we close the door on this long and bitter tale, we return to that silence, not as denial, but as a moment of reverence because the dead remember. And now, so do you.